Dinner wasn't about filling your stomach, it was about filling your reputation. In Edwardian England between 1901 and 1914, sitting down at a dinner party wasn't just a chance to enjoy a good roast, it was essentially an audition for your place in society. Forget TV shows, forget football, forget scrolling endlessly through your phone. If you were wealthy in the Edwardian era, your entire evening's entertainment revolved around a table, an absurd number of forks, and the high-stakes theatre of eating slowly under the watchful eye of everyone who mattered. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight we will explore the topic why Edwardian dinner parties lasted all night, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The Edwardian period, that small glittering slice of time between the grimy grime of the Victorians and the explosions of the First World War, was defined by wealth, indulgence and leisure, at least for the people who could afford it. The upper classes treated life like a permanent garden party, and dinner was their crown jewel, while the majority of Britons still toiled in factories, coal mines or kitchens. The Edwardian elite were busy polishing silverware and planning seating charts that could make or break reputations. Why? Because dinner wasn't about food, it was about display. Imagine combining a networking event, a Broadway production, and a fashion show, then serving it with soup. That's essentially what an Edwardian dinner party was. It wasn't enough to have money, you had to show it. And the best way to show it was through hospitality, lavish dining rooms, over-the-top menus, and an atmosphere where your guests left either impressed or quietly sharpening their gossiping knives. The Edwardians had inherited the Victorians' obsession with appearances, but added an extra layer of sparkle and leisure. King Edward VII himself, the man who gave the era its name, loved nothing more than a good party. He was a king of indulgence, known for long banquets, too much champagne, and more mistresses than one man really needs to keep track of. Naturally, his subjects, or at least the wealthy ones who wanted to copy him, followed suit. If the king was hosting marathon feasts, then everyone else had better step up their game. This meant that the dinner table became the battlefield of social survival. Invitations were coveted like golden tickets. Being invited meant you were in. Being snubbed meant you were one polite cough away from social death. And once you made it to the table, every detail mattered. How you dressed, how you spoke, even how you handled your cutlery. All of it was judged by the eyes across the table. Edwardian dinner parties weren't simply meals, they were examinations with no clear answer sheet. The dining rooms themselves were stages, richly decorated with chandeliers, mahogany furniture, velvet drapes and walls lined with portraits of ancestors who looked as if they'd never laughed in their lives. The setting was meant to overwhelm. You weren't just eating, you were performing in a room designed to remind you of the host's wealth. You could almost hear the wallpaper whispering, "Yes, they can afford this, can you?" And performances they were. The host was the director, orchestrating the entire event to show off their grandeur. The guests were both audience and actors, required to laugh at the right jokes, compliment the decor, and sip their wine without slurping. Even the food, however many courses it came in, was more about symbolism than substance. A lavish menu wasn't there to feed you, but to feed your sense of awe. What made all this more fascinating is that Edwardian society was obsessed with leisure, unlike their Victorian predecessors, who liked to at least pretend they were hard-working and modest. The Edwardians embraced the idea that life should be enjoyed, provided you had the money, of course. Tennis, golf, polo, garden parties, afternoon teas, and of course endless dinners filled their calendars. But dinner was the jewel of the crown, because unlike polo or fox hunting, everyone could sit down at a table and judge each other for hours. And the timing? Oh, it was deliberate. Edwardian dinners often began around 8 o'clock in the evening. Why so late? Because it allowed everyone plenty of time to spend the afternoon getting ready, polishing boots, adjusting gowns, or nervously praying that their conversational skills wouldn't desert them. Once dinner started, you weren't just committing to a meal, You were committing to an entire evening, sometimes stretching until 2 in the morning. For the elite, this wasn't excessive. This was the point. Of course, outside this glittering bubble, most of Britain was eating something much simpler: bread, stews, or potatoes wolfed down after exhausting labour. But the Edwardians loved contrast. The more excessive their dinners, the greater the distance between them and the rest of the world. Eating slowly, extravagantly, and excessively became a way of saying, "Look at us, we are not like you." So when we ask, why did Edwardian dinner parties last all night? The first answer is simple: because they could. They had the time, the wealth, and the vanity to turn dinner into an endurance sport. It wasn't survival, it was a spectacle, a nightly performance where the stage lights were chandeliers, the props were silver spoons, and the actors were all too aware that every bite and every word could make or break their place in the spotlight. The Edwardian dinner table wasn't just about what was served, it was about what was at stake: social power, prestige, and the ability to say, with every polished wine glass and carefully arranged flower centerpiece, "We are the elite, and we intend to stay that way, even if it takes us 8 hours to do it." Being seated next to the wrong person was the Edwardian version of losing Wi-Fi. One moment you're hoping for witty banter and sparkling conversation, the next you're stuck with someone who thinks small talk means reading you the shipping forecast. And in Edwardian England, a bad dinner partner wasn't just dull, they could sink your reputation faster than a Titanic iceberg. The Edwardian dinner party wasn't about food, though we'll get to the mountain of courses later. It was about people. More specifically, it was about who you were seen with, who you were placed beside, and who wasn't even allowed past the front door. Invitations were social currency. If you got one, it meant you had value. If you didn't, it meant you were about as socially relevant as a damp umbrella. Getting invited to an Edwardian dinner party was a triumph in itself. The hosts were essentially curators of society, hand-picking their guest list the way a museum might select priceless artworks. Invitations weren't sent out casually. They were statements. If you were invited, it told the world you were desirable. Not romantically, though sometimes that too, but socially. Your presence gave the event legitimacy. For ambitious social climbers, the dinner invitation was the holy grail. Edwardian society had strict class lines, but there were cracks in the wall. Wealthy industrialists, colonial magnates, or anyone with enough money could, with the right invitation, start to slip into circles that once would have slammed the door in their face. An appearance at a duchess's dinner table was the best advertisement that you had arrived. But it wasn't all good news. With the right invitation came enormous pressure, decline without a very good excuse, and you risked offense. And you had to navigate hours of high-stakes small talk without putting a foot wrong. This was networking without email or LinkedIn, and the only endorsements that mattered were the nods of approval across the table. Once you got through the gilded doors, the game had only just begun. Where you sat was the true indicator of your importance. Hosts spent days agonizing over seating charts, balancing friendships, rivalries, flirtations, and outright scandals. At the head of the table, the host and hostess presided like gods, with the most important guests seated closest to them. As you moved down the table, the importance scale dropped, and everyone knew it. To be seated at the far end of the table was the Edwardian equivalent of being banished to the kids' table at Thanksgiving. You might as well have been invisible. But the arrangement wasn't just about rank, it was about chemistry. A clever hostess would never seat two rivals together, unless of course she wanted sparks to fly for entertainment. She might place a wealthy but boring guest beside a witty conversationalist to keep things lively, or engineer encounters that hinted at potential marriages. The table was less a dining arrangement and more a matchmaking board, a political chess game played with silver forks, and heaven help the guest who broke the unspoken rules. Talking past your neighbor to someone further down was considered rude. Failing to engage in conversation with the person beside you was social sabotage. If you were seated next to a bore, you had to grin and bear it, praying dessert came quickly. After all, the host had chosen this pairing for a reason, and questioning it was like telling the director you didn't like your role. But let's not forget the other side of the guest list, those who didn't make the cut. Not being invited to a particular dinner was often more scandalous than being invited. Society gossiped endlessly about who was left out and why. Perhaps a family had fallen on hard times. Perhaps there was a whiff of scandal, a divorce, a financial misstep, or even worse, bad manners at a previous party. One wrong move at dinner, a joke that fell flat, a spill of claret on the host's priceless carpet could land you in the never again pile, and being snubbed once could snowball, as other hosts took note. To vanish from dinner invitations was to vanish from society altogether. Hosts, meanwhile, had their own balancing act. Invite too many of one type, say industrial millionaires with more money than titles, and you risked looking nouveau rich. Too few, and you risked being accused of snobbery. Every guest list was a tightrope between prestige and novelty, a way of proving that your household was at the cutting edge of society. For the ambitious, dinners were career opportunities. Politicians courted allies, debutantes hoped for favorable matches, writers sought patrons, and everyone sought gossip to fuel their next gathering. An evening spent with the right people could open doors to government posts, marriages, or lucrative investments. A bad evening could just as easily slam them shut. Think of it this way. Edwardian dinners were like live-action social media. You displayed yourself, made connections, and carefully crafted your image, only with more cutlery and fewer cat memes. All of this created a dinner party environment where who was there mattered far more than what was served. The goose might be overcooked, the pudding might collapse, but as long as the right duke was laughing with the right duchess, the evening was a triumph. Food spoiled? Forget it. Guests spoiled? Catastrophe. The Edwardians lived in a world where appearances ruled everything. Dinner guests weren't just names on a list. They were reputations, stepping stones, or obstacles. The right invitation could elevate you. The wrong seating arrangement could embarrass you. And being left out altogether, that was a social death sentence with no resurrection. So if Edwardian dinners lasted all night, it wasn't just because of the courses or the wine. It was because every glance, every conversation, every seat at the table was loaded with meaning. Dinner was less about what you put in your mouth and more about who you were seen opening it next to. Corsets weren't just restrictive. They were medieval torture devices with better branding. Before an Edwardian dinner party even began, hours of preparation had already been spent ensuring that every guest arrived looking less like a human being and more like a walking advertisement for wealth, status, and fashion magazines that hadn't even been invented yet. If the dinner table was a stage, then the costumes were everything, and Edwardian society loved a good costume. For women, dressing for dinner was a full-body project that required patience, money, and sometimes a small army of servants. Gowns were not pulled casually from a wardrobe. They were carefully selected to reflect both the season and the occasion. A dinner gown was different from a walking gown, which was different from a tea gown, which was in turn completely inappropriate if you tried to wear it to dinner. Wearing the wrong gown at the wrong time was the social equivalent of turning up at a wedding in pajamas. No one would ever let you forget it. A proper dinner dress was designed to stun. Rich silks, velvets, and satins shimmered in candlelight, often embroidered with lace or decorated with beadwork that caught every flicker of a chandelier. Necklines were daring, sleeves were short, and the designs emphasized elegance over practicality. You couldn't exactly bend over in one of these gowns, but then again, you weren't expected to. The gown was there to be admired, not to be useful. Of course, no gown could achieve its desired effect without the unsung villain of Edwardian fashion, the corset. These stiff whalebone contraptions were marketed as healthful, body-shaping marvels. In reality, they cinched waists so tightly that women fainted more often than desserts were served. Breathing was optional, sitting comfortably was impossible, and if you managed to eat more than a few bites of your 12-course meal, you deserved a medal. But corsets created the coveted S-shaped figure, pushing the chest forward and the hips back. a silhouette that screamed refinement and occasionally oxygen deprivation. Jewelry was just as important as the gown itself. Diamonds, pearls, and tiaras weren't kept for weddings or royal events. They were standard dinner accessories for anyone who could afford them. The brighter, the better. After all, in a dining room lit by flickering lamps and candles, jewelry did the heavy lifting of catching attention. If you couldn't think of anything clever to say at the table, at least your necklace could sparkle in your defense. Hair was another battlefield. Women piled their locks into elaborate pompadours that seemed to defy gravity, pinned into place with combs, jewels, or feathers. The higher the hair, the greater the drama. Some hairstyles were so ambitious they risked brushing against chandeliers if one stood up too quickly. Servants and hairdressers spent hours arranging these towers of hair, and the finished product was less casual dinner and more structural engineering project. Men, on the other hand, had an easier time, but not by much. Evening dress for gentlemen was rigidly codified. Tuxedos, or more formally white tie and tails, were required, along with crisp shirts, spotless gloves, and perfectly shined shoes. While men didn't have corsets to contend with, they did have to spend an uncomfortable amount of time buttoned, starched, and trussed up like parcels waiting to be delivered. A man's bow tie had to be tied just so, his cuffs gleaming, his shoes mirror-polished. Showing up with a wrinkled shirt or scuffed shoe wasn't merely sloppy, it was offensive, like insulting your host to their face. The result was that dinner parties often felt like a fashion exhibition where everyone was both model and critic. Clothing wasn't just for show, it was a form of social armor. It told the room who you were, how much money you had, and whether you belonged in that circle. For women, a well-chosen gown could signal wealth, good taste, or eligibility. For men, impeccable tailoring showed that you respected tradition and understood the rules of the game. But underneath all the satin and starch, the whole business was profoundly uncomfortable. Corsets dug into ribs, shoes pinched toes, collars choked throats, and hairpins threatened scalps. Guests looked like glamorous swans gliding across a lake, but beneath the surface they were all desperately paddling, holding in gasps for breath, or wishing they could sneak off and unlace something. Fashion in the Edwardian dinner world was less about comfort and more about suffering beautifully. Still, there was no denying the impact. A glittering dining room filled with men in black tails and women in shimmering gowns was as much a spectacle as any play or concert. The first impression a guest made wasn't through words but through the rustle of silk, the sparkle of jewels, and the flash of polished shoes across a marble floor. The dinner may have lasted all night, but the judgment on your outfit was instant. To the Edwardians, dressing for dinner was a ritual, a declaration of status, and a silent competition. Who had the newest Parisian gown, who wore heirloom diamonds, who dared push the fashion boundaries just enough to be noticed, but not enough to be gossiped about. The dining room was not merely a place to eat, it was a catwalk, and every guest walked it, whether they liked it or not. So if you're wondering why Edwardian dinner parties seemed to stretch endlessly into the night, remember that the feasting was only half the event. The costumes did the rest. Dinner was never just about the food on the table. It was about the glitter, the glamour, and the gasp that went around the room when the latest arrival swept through the door, corseted, jeweled, and ready to withstand hours of elegant discomfort, all in the name of looking flawless. Dinner was less about calories and more about endurance, like eating an Olympic triathlon, but with gravy. An Edwardian feast wasn't something you simply sat down and finished. It was a marathon designed to test the limits of the human stomach, complete with more courses than an entire culinary school syllabus. By the end of the evening, guests weren't just full, they were spiritually transformed, hovering somewhere between awe and indigestion. A proper Edwardian dinner could stretch to 8, 10, or even 12 courses. Each course was a performance, arriving with fanfare on silver trays carried by a small army of liveried servants. These weren't your modest meat and 2 veg meals. No, this was an edible hierarchy, starting with the polite introductions of soup and fish before working its way up to full-blown juggernauts of roast meat, exotic game and desserts, so elaborate they looked more like architecture than food. The order of courses was sacred, a kind of culinary choreography. First came the soup, often rich, thick, and designed to warm the palate rather than satisfy it. Then came the fish course, sole, salmon, or perhaps something imported, and therefore prohibitively expensive. After that, the meat began to march in, roasts, poultry, game birds, sometimes even multiple kinds of meat in a single course, just to remind you that animals existed solely for your dining pleasure. Grant. Vegetables were present, of course, but not as the stars of the show. They were supporting characters, often overcooked into submission and smothered with butter. Salads appeared later, usually after the heavy meats, not as a refreshing beginning but as a polite interlude, as if to say, don't worry, we'll cleanse your palate before we destroy it again. And then came puddings, pastries, and elaborate desserts, towers of molded jelly, ornate cakes, sugar sculptures, and ice creams in flavors that suggested both extravagance and poor judgment. An Edwardian cook might send out a bombe glacée shaped like a swan, or a cake decorated so heavily it looked like it could survive artillery fire. Fruit was the finale, but not just any fruit. Exotic imports like pineapples or bananas might appear, each one a small fortune shipped across oceans simply to be admired on a plate before someone nervously sliced into it. The sheer scale of it all wasn't really about flavor. Nobody could actually enjoy 12 courses without their digestive system lodging a formal complaint. The point was display. To serve this many courses showed that you had money, connections, and a kitchen staff large enough to operate a battleship. If your guests left feeling overwhelmed, you had succeeded. And while the food may sound impressive on paper, it wasn't always delicious in practice. Overcomplicated sauces, heavy gravies, and endless layers of gelatin meant that subtlety was rarely on the menu. Dishes weren't designed to delight the tongue so much as dazzle the eye. A pie might be shaped like a castle. A roast bird might arrive with its feathers reattached for decoration, and sugar sculptures might tower precariously until someone sneezed too close. Eating it was secondary. Admiring it was essential. The pacing of the meal made things even more daunting. Servants would glide in and out, presenting each dish with solemn dignity, then whisking it away as soon as it was finished, or more often, half-finished. You weren't expected to eat everything. You were expected to acknowledge everything. Taking a polite bite or two was enough to prove you were participating. Actually finishing your plate might be interpreted as a sign you hadn't eaten properly at home, which in Edwardian society was practically an insult. Wine accompanied every stage with careful pairings chosen by the host's cellar master. Champagne to start, white with fish, red with meat, fortified wines with dessert, and then, if you weren't already reeling, brandy to close the evening. By the time the fruit course arrived, most guests were a blend of pleasantly drowsy and dangerously overstuffed, trying not to calculate how long it had been since the soup first arrived. The menu wasn't just about showing off wealth, but about demonstrating mastery of tradition. There was a correct order to courses, a proper way to balance heavy and light dishes, and a particular logic to ending on something sweet. Hosts who managed this orchestration successfully were applauded. Those who stumbled risked whispered criticism from guests who pretended to be too polite to notice but remembered every detail for later gossip. For the servants, these meals were logistical nightmares. Every course had to be prepared, plated, and timed to perfection. Dozens of dishes were circulating at once, each one requiring its own utensils, accompaniments, and presentation. A well-run Edwardian dinner was less like a kitchen and more like a military operation. Except instead of marching troops, you were deploying soufflés and hoping they didn't collapse under pressure. For the guests, surviving such a dinner required stamina. There was no skipping a course, no pushing your plate aside with a mutter about being full. You had to soldier on, smiling politely as another towering confection was placed in front of you, pretending that yes, of course you had room for another sliver of roast pheasant, thank you so much. By the end of the evening, people weren't just digesting food, they were digesting the sheer absurdity of what they had just endured. In short, the Edwardian menu was never about nourishment, it was about performance. It was about proving that your household could afford ice sculptors, imported fruit, and enough silver cutlery to outfit an army. It was a demonstration of wealth disguised as dinner, a ritual where the flavors were less important than the statement they made. And the statement was clear: we have enough time, money, and stomach lining to survive a 12-course spectacle. Can you? If Edwardian dinner parties were a theater of wealth and spectacle, then etiquette was the unforgiving script. Miss a line and you risked being cut from the cast entirely. Forget the food, forget the fashion. What truly made or broke you in Edwardian dining was how you maneuvered a forest of silverware, glassware, and social expectations, all while pretending to be at ease. Dinner was not simply a meal. It was an obstacle course with invisible tripwires, and survival depended on flawless performance. To begin, let's talk forks, not just the fork. Oh no, that would be far too simple. An Edwardian dinner table resembled the arsenal of a particularly snobbish cutlery enthusiast. You had the oyster fork, the fish fork, the salad fork, the entree fork, and the dessert fork, each with its own subtle design and exact placement. Grabbing the wrong one was more than a slip. It was a public declaration that you didn't belong. Imagine everyone at the table watching you spear your fish with the salad fork. It wasn't just a utensil error, it was social suicide. Guests were trained to work from the outside in, moving their way toward the plate like a polite excavation of culinary excess. Heaven forbid you forgot this system, because even the host's most dazzling chandelier couldn't distract from a fork-based faux pas. And then came the glasses. Wine was not just served, it was curated, matched course by course like partners at a waltz. One glass for sherry, another for claret, another for champagne, and still another for port, each with its own shape and size which you had to recognize instantly, like a sommelier in training. Taking the wrong sip was like skipping a verse in the national anthem. Technically survivable, but your reputation might not recover. The golden rule? Follow the host's lead. If he reached for the champagne flute, so did you. If she lifted the claret glass, you followed suit. Fail to keep up, and you'd stand out like a trombone in a string quartet. Even posture was weaponized etiquette. You didn't slump, you didn't lean back, and under no circumstances did you rest your elbows on the table, unless you wanted to be mistaken for a dock worker rather than a gentleman. Women were instructed to sit with straight backs, hands delicately poised, as though balancing an invisible crown on their heads. Men had it no easier. Their job was to cut meat without causing a scene, a knife scraping too loudly or a piece of bread torn with excessive vigor. Catastrophe. The Edwardians were essentially practicing dinner yoga, controlled breathing, delicate movements, and a stiff spine, all while trapped in clothing designed for discomfort. Conversation was another minefield. You couldn't talk across the table, only to the person on your left or right, switching midway through the meal to keep things balanced. Dominating the conversation made you gauche, but being too quiet made you dull. The topics themselves were tightly policed. No religion, no politics, no money. In other words, nothing people actually wanted to talk about. Acceptable subjects included art, travel, or the weather, provided you delivered them with charm and wit. If you accidentally wandered into scandalous gossip, you risked not just the host's disapproval, but possibly their lifelong grudge. Think of it as the Edwardian version of tweeting something you shouldn't, except instead of being ratioed, you were never invited back. And then came the most feared rule of all, knowing when to stop eating. You couldn't wolf down your plate, but you also couldn't dawdle like a distracted child. Timing was everything. Too fast, and you appeared greedy. Too slow, and you held up the next course, inconveniencing everyone. The signal that you were finished wasn't pushing your plate away or making an announcement. It was the silent language of cutlery. Fork and knife placed together, handles at 4 o'clock, blade inward, anything else, and you risked confusing the staff into thinking you were merely resting, which could result in an awkward scene of your plate being whisked away while you were mid-bite. Even laughter had boundaries. Too loud, vulgar, too restrained, unfriendly. Edwardian etiquette required the perfect Goldilocks chuckle, warm enough to show sociability, but contained enough to remind everyone you were raised properly. Essentially, the Edwardian dinner table was a finishing school exam disguised as a feast. The terrifying truth was this: one mistake could haunt you. Hosts took mental notes, guests whispered, families built reputations not just on wealth but on flawless adherence to these rules. A gentleman might be worth a fortune in coal mines, but if he buttered his bread with the wrong knife, polite society might close its doors. Dinner was the battlefield where social climbing could either succeed spectacularly or crash into ruins. So yes, you might have been surrounded by glittering chandeliers, sparkling jewels, and the finest food money could buy. But at the end of the day, Edwardian dinner etiquette was less about elegance and more about survival. It wasn't just a matter of eating politely, it was a matter of proving you were civilized enough to stay at the table at all. And if you're thinking this all sounds exhausting, you'd be absolutely right, which leads us to the next ordeal. When the meal itself wasn't enough to impress, Edwardians turned to after-dinner rituals designed to showcase status, taste, and a little bit of theatrical flair. If you thought the 12 courses of fish, fowl, beef, puddings, and petits fours were the real gauntlet of an Edwardian dinner, think again. The true battlefield wasn't on the plate. It was in the air, hovering over the table like cigar smoke in the drawing room. Conversation was the main course, and unlike the soup, you couldn't just politely push it around with your spoon. Your words, tone, and timing could either crown you the toast of the evening or doom you to social exile. And since reputation was the currency of Edwardian high society, your ability to navigate dinner conversation was as important as your bank account, if not more so. Let's begin with the basics, what you could talk about. Edwardian conversation was a performance, carefully rehearsed but meant to appear effortless, like a ballerina who insists she's not sweating. Topics were selected with surgical precision. Safe bets included the latest exhibit at the Royal Academy, the opera season at Covent Garden, or the gossip about who had been seen walking with whom in Hyde Park. These were the conversational bread rolls, light, easy, and plentiful. But stray too far into politics, and you risked spilling claret all over your social standing, unless of course you knew your audience. A witty remark about the Boer War might make you sound informed among military men, but in mixed company it could come across as unbearably crass. This balancing act was no accident. Hosts often orchestrated not just who sat next to whom, but what they were expected to talk about. Think of it as a verbal menu. One guest was placed to provide a witty anecdote, another to contribute gravitas, and a third to laugh at all the right moments. Conversation wasn't a free-for-all. It was a symphony, and heaven help you if you hit the wrong note. And yes, people practiced. Manuals on etiquette and society columns in newspapers often offered tips on how to steer dialogue gracefully, how to be amusing without being vulgar, and how to compliment without sounding like you were writing bad poetry. Now, if you're thinking this sounds exhausting, you're right. Imagine preparing not only your wardrobe and posture, but also rehearsing clever remarks in your head just in case someone asked for your opinion on the Impressionists. Dinner was a marathon of mental gymnastics. You couldn't just sit back and zone out the way you might at a modern work function waiting for someone to mention the weather. Weather was, in fact, strictly off the menu, unless you could connect it to yachting on the Riviera or fox hunting in Norfolk. The stakes were high because conversation was where alliances were built and destroyed, business deals were seeded between bites of venison, marriages were negotiated between spoonfuls of blancmange, political favours were nudged forward with a subtle "well, of course, my dear chap." If you should ever find yourself in need of support in the Commons, saying the wrong thing wasn't just embarrassing, it could genuinely cost you a fortune or a future. In that sense, conversation was less like dessert and more like Russian roulette, except instead of a revolver you were armed with wit, and instead of death you faced something worse, being uninvited next time. Of course, there was also the question of how you spoke. The Edwardian upper crust had a finely tuned ear for accents, cadence, and vocabulary. Drop an ain't where a shan't should be, and you might as well have walked in barefoot. Eloquence was a weapon, but so was restraint. Too much chatter, and you were a bore. Too little, and you were deemed icy. The ideal conversationalist glided in with just enough wit to sparkle, just enough seriousness to impress, and just enough deference to flatter the host. It was, in other words, the social equivalent of juggling flaming torches while balancing on a unicycle. Humor was allowed, even encouraged, but it had to be precise. Edwardians adored a sharp quip, especially if it could be delivered at someone else's expense without seeming cruel. But heaven forbid you tell a joke that smelled of vulgarity. Double entendres were strictly off the table, unless you were dining with a particularly avant-garde set in Bloomsbury. Wit was supposed to cut, not bruise. If you were really skilled, you could make a remark so deliciously pointed that everyone laughed while the victim only realized they'd been skewered 3 hours later on the carriage ride home. And then there was the unspoken but critical rule: don't outshine the host. A dazzling one-liner might win you admirers, but if it made your host look like the dullest person at their own table, you'd committed social heresy. The art was to shine just brightly enough to be remembered, but not so brightly that you eclipsed anyone else. Think of it as conversational dimmer switches: too low, and you vanished; too high, and you burned the drapes. All of this pressure naturally created casualties. Many an Edwardian guest found themselves stammering, sweating, or choking on syllables as the table waited for their contribution. The silence as they floundered was deafening, the social equivalent of forgetting your password during a live stream. And once word spread that you were a conversational dud, it clung to you like cologne. You might still get invited, but you'd find yourself relegated to the dull end of the table, next to Uncle Percival, who only wanted to discuss his gout. So yes, the endless Edwardian dinner was physically taxing, but the true endurance test was mental. Every sentence was a gamble, every anecdote a balancing act, every laugh a potential ladder or trapdoor. Conversation was the true feast of the evening, and like all feasts, only the most skillful diners came away satisfied. If the Edwardian dinner party looked effortless, that's because an entire army of exhausted, underpaid, and impeccably trained servants made sure it was. Behind every crystal glass filled at precisely the right moment, every silver dish that arrived without a splatter, and every candle that didn't sputter at the wrong time, there was a small miracle happening out of sight. To the guests, the evening was all silk gowns and witty repartee. To the staff, it was a military campaign in tails and aprons. In the grandest Edwardian households, you weren't simply dealing with a cook and a maid or two. A well-to-do estate employed dozens butlers at the top of the indoor hierarchy. Footmen acting as the silent ballet dancers of dinner service, parlour maids tidying and polishing endlessly, and armies of scullery maids and kitchen hands who never saw the light of the drawing room. It was a system designed to ensure the host and hostess could glide through their evening as though serving a 12-course meal to 30 guests required no more effort than boiling an egg. The butler, of course, was the general. He managed the wine cellar, orchestrated the service, and kept one eye on the guests while the other monitored his team like a hawk. A guest lingering too long on an empty glass, he'd flick a glance, and within moments a footman would appear, silent as fog, to top it off. The hostess might have taken credit for the evening's polish, but everyone knew the butler was the true puppeteer pulling the strings. Then came the footman, tall, powdered, and dressed in livery that often cost more than a guest's outfit. They were chosen for looks as much as for skill, because appearances mattered as much below stairs as they did above. A footman's role was to glide in and out of the dining room, balancing heavy trays, clearing plates with a movement so smooth it looked rehearsed, and doing it all without ever interrupting a conversation. To stumble, to drop a fork, or worse, to spill wine, was nothing short of catastrophe. The humorless truth was that a single slip could earn you dismissal, or at least weeks of humiliation whispered behind your back by other staff. In the kitchens, however, things were far from graceful. If the dining room was a theatre of elegance, the kitchen was the war zone backstage. Cooks barked orders, scullery maids scrubbed mountains of dishes until their hands turned raw, and the heat from the ranges turned the air into a swampy haze. Timing was everything. Dishes had to emerge in perfect order, plated with precision, and carried upstairs before so much as a potato went cold. You didn't need an army, You needed an army with perfect synchronization. The extraordinary part was the invisibility of it all. Guests weren't supposed to acknowledge the staff, let alone interact with them beyond the occasional polite murmur. A successful dinner party was one in which you almost forgot that human beings were doing all the hard work. They floated in and out of the room like ghosts with excellent balancing skills, existing only as extensions of the household's grandeur. It was an odd paradox. Servants were essential, but the ideal was to pretend they weren't there at all. And yet, everyone noticed when something went wrong. A plate delivered to the wrong guest, a dish arriving lukewarm, or a glass that sat unfilled for too long could send ripples of disdain through the dining room. Guests rarely blamed their host outright. Instead, they whispered about the sloppiness of the staff, which of course reflected back on the household's reputation. The smooth operation of this invisible machine was as much about maintaining social standing as it was about serving food. For the servants themselves, dinner parties were nerve-wracking marathons, while the guests drank, laughed, and occasionally debated politics. The staff ran up and down staircases, balanced dishes on trembling arms, and tried not to faint from exhaustion in their starchy uniforms. And remember, this wasn't a quick affair. An Edwardian dinner could stretch for 8 hours, meaning the people making it all happen endured an entire workday in one evening on top of the 10 or 12 hours they'd already put in preparing for it. If you think the guests were performing social gymnastics at the table, spare a thought for the servants who had to execute perfection while being as invisible as possible. To succeed was to be unseen. To fail was to be unforgettable in the worst way. Dinner parties may have been about power, spectacle and social standing for those seated at the table. But for the servants, they were an endurance test of strength, grace and nerves. And when the last guest finally tottered home in the early hours of the morning, clutching their waistcoat or their pearls, the staff had one more task left, cleaning up the battlefield. Because tomorrow there might be another dinner, another performance, and another chance for a butler to orchestrate a flawless illusion while a footman prayed not to drop the soup. Once the last spoon scraped against porcelain and the final glass of claret had been drained, the evening was far from over. In Edwardian households, dinner was only the first act. What followed was a carefully orchestrated ritual of division, a social choreography where men and women were neatly separated into different rooms, as though conversation itself carried gendered particles. The men shuffled off to bask in the smoky haze of cigars and the deep burn of brandy, while the women glided to the drawing room for lighter talk, tea, and piano tinkling. To us, it may sound like an unnecessary intermission, but for Edwardians, this division was practically sacred, a hallmark of good breeding and proper society. For men, the smoking room was a sanctuary. Freed from the delicate ears of women, they could drop the polished banter and wade into more serious subjects: politics, finance, foreign policy, and occasionally the thrilling subject of how much they spent on their last hunting trip. With thick cigar smoke curling around their heads like halos of superiority, men performed a ritual that was equal parts bonding exercise and posturing contest. The brandy wasn't just alcohol, it was a badge of masculinity, each sip a statement that you had survived yet another 12-course feast and were now strong enough to tackle imperial policy, or at the very least complain about taxes. Meanwhile, in the drawing room, the women were engaged in their own balancing act, though without the benefit of brandy to steady the nerves. Instead, they entertained each other with social gossip, artistic critiques, and if the hostess was truly ambitious, a bit of piano playing or poetry reading to set the tone. This wasn't idle chatter, it was a continuation of the evening's performance. A woman's wit, poise, and ability to steer conversation without straying into the improper was a measure of her social capital. To Edwardian women, maintaining the illusion of effortless charm was every bit as exhausting as the corsets they had to sit in while doing it. The separation wasn't just about convenience, it was loaded with symbolism. Men claimed the realm of politics, economy, and power, while women were nudged toward refinement, beauty, and social cohesion. In short, the men smoked like empires depended on it, and the women sipped tea as though their reputations did. And to some extent, both were right. To deviate from this gendered script was to risk scandal, and scandal was the one thing more indigestible than undercooked pheasant. Of course, these divides weren't ironclad. Now and then, a daring hostess would blur the lines. Some progressive households allowed women to join the men for cigars, raising more than eyebrows in the process. Others kept the groups apart but subtly competed. A drawing room filled with witty women could easily outshine a smoking room of half-drunk men slurring their thoughts on parliamentary reform. And when the two groups finally reunited, as they inevitably did, everyone was suddenly on their best behavior, presenting a polished version of themselves, as though the prior hour hadn't involved either scandalous gossip or wildly exaggerated war stories. The humor of it all is hard to miss. The men, puffing away, thought themselves the intellectual backbone of the nation, while the women were busy holding the threads of society together with a blend of conversation and charm. Both sides were playing roles, and both knew it. It was theatre disguised as tradition, a nightly performance that kept the Edwardian machine of class, gender, and status humming smoothly. The irony, of course, is that everyone probably would have had more fun if they had just stayed together. But rules were rules, and Edwardian society loved nothing more than to take a perfectly good evening and complicate it with ritual. Men smoked to look powerful, women sipped tea to look delicate, and everyone pretended to enjoy it. In reality, both sides were often equally bored, equally restrained, and equally relieved when the evening finally began to wind down. Yet these gendered rituals reveal more than just quirks of etiquette. They show how even leisure was weaponized in the name of social order. Dinner might have filled your stomach, but what happened after filled your reputation. If you've ever stared at your watch during a modern dinner party and wondered why the cheese plate hasn't arrived yet, spare a thought for the Edwardians. Their dinners didn't just stretch on for hours. They were a full-blown endurance event, designed less for satisfying hunger and more for demonstrating that you had nothing better to do than sit around eating, talking, and drinking for half a day. The Edwardian elite didn't believe in rushing. To them, slowness was luxury, and dinner was not a meal, it was a marathon. The pacing began before the first course even arrived. Guests would trickle into the dining room like migrating birds, slowly and ceremoniously finding their assigned seats. Seating wasn't casual, it was a delicate chessboard of social strategy. Who sat next to whom mattered deeply, since conversation was meant to flow across carefully matched personalities, or clash if the host enjoyed a bit of drama. Once everyone was seated, the first course didn't come quickly. It arrived only after prolonged pauses filled with pleasantries, as if anticipation itself was part of the flavor profile. The courses themselves stretched time even further. An Edwardian dinner wasn't just appetizer, main, dessert. No, it was an extravagant parade of fish, roasts, game birds, puddings, ices, and sweetmeats, each interspersed with wine, champagne, or some other liquid courage. But the key wasn't how much food there was, it was how slowly it was served. Each course was brought in with ritualized pauses, the kind that let conversation breathe and allowed stomachs to prepare for yet another assault. Plates weren't whisked away quickly. They lingered, letting guests admire, discuss, or even poke at dishes long after the taste had faded. This deliberate pacing was itself a social statement. A middle-class family might eat dinner in half an hour and hurry on to something else, but the wealthy had the luxury of wasting time. If you had hours to devote to a single meal, it showed you weren't burdened with work, responsibility, or really anything practical at all. The dinner table became a stage for showcasing not just wealth but leisure. And in Edwardian society, leisure was power. Wine pairings also helped stretch the evening to near geological scales. Each course often demanded its own drink, a white wine for the fish, a red for the meat, champagne to refresh, port with the pudding, brandy to seal the deal. By the time dessert rolled around, the average guest was so buoyed by alcohol that time itself seemed elastic. What might have felt like 3 hours to a sober man could easily extend to 6 when you factored in a dozen glasses of wine and a belly full of roast pheasant. Conversation added its own slow burn to the event. This wasn't idle chit-chat that ran its course in 15 minutes. No, Edwardian hosts encouraged long, looping dialogues that could span the length of multiple courses. Guests might discuss politics, literature, art, or who had made an unfortunate dress choice at the last ball. Each subject was dissected with the same care as the pheasant, and just when you thought the matter was settled, someone would raise a counterpoint, ensuring that the debate could stretch through the sorbet and well into the cheese course. The dinner was less about eating than about creating a flowing symphony of talk, each guest contributing a note. And then there were the pauses. Oh, the pauses. Modern dining thrives on efficiency. Plates cleared quickly, next courses ready to go. But Edwardian pacing embraced gaps in the action. These silences were not accidents. They were deliberate breathing spaces, carefully timed so no one felt hurried. They allowed the servants to reset the stage and the guests to recompose themselves, adjust a corset, or prepare a new anecdote. Imagine the dinner table as a long play with multiple acts, each one separated by dramatic pauses to build suspense. If the meal itself seemed endless, the rituals after dinner extended things further. When the women retired to the drawing room and the men lingered over cigars and brandy, this wasn't the end of the evening. It was merely another act in the performance. Hours could pass before guests finally departed, often well past midnight, with the sense that they had taken part in a grand, drawn-out spectacle. Ultimately, Edwardian dinners lasted so long because they weren't designed to be meals. They were social marathons, theatrical performances, and subtle contests of endurance, all disguised as a pleasant evening with friends. To eat quickly would have been to miss the point entirely. The whole affair was about stretching time, luxuriating in it, and proving you had the wealth, stamina, and patience to treat dinner as an event rather than an obligation. The humor lies in imagining how we would fare today. Most of us would tap out somewhere around the sixth course, reaching for stretchy pants and a nap. But the Edwardians? They dined as if there was no tomorrow, as if every bite, every sip, and every laugh was another chance to declare their place in the hierarchy of leisure. They didn't eat dinner at night. They lived in it like a lease agreement, one that locked you in for at least 8 hours with no early exit clause. The dinner itself might have lasted until the early hours, but the true spectacle often arrived the next morning. The Edwardian feast was not a single-night affair. It was a stone thrown into a very shallow pond of aristocratic life, sending ripples across households, newspapers, and digestive systems. Survival meant more than keeping your elbows off the table. You had to navigate the aftermath, where consequences were as real as the brandy-induced headaches. Let's start with the most immediate fallout: indigestion. Edwardian banquets routinely stacked 10 or more courses, from oysters and consommé to pheasant and puddings, heavy enough to qualify as building materials. Stomachs were expected to endure this marathon, yet without refrigeration or modern food safety, guests often woke up with more than fond memories. They got heartburn, indigestion, or worse. Doctors of the time loved prescribing digestive tonics, often containing alcohol or opium, so if the feast didn't finish you off, the medicine might. For many, the morning after wasn't a pleasant stroll in the garden. It was a grim negotiation between laudanum, bicarbonate, and regret. Then came the gossip. The Edwardian upper crust was less a social class and more a competitive sport, and dinner was the prime playing field. Every misplaced fork, every unfortunate joke, every scandalous seating arrangement became fodder for chatter. If you accidentally ignored the dowager countess or spilled consommé on a duchess's sleeve, expect to find your faux pas retold, embroidered, and gleefully dissected over breakfast tables across town. Polite society was built on reputation, and reputation was alarmingly fragile. As one wag might have said, "You're only as good as your last dinner party." The stakes were high because these events weren't just about food, they were about influence. A successful evening could vault a family into better circles. If your feast impressed, the wines were smooth, the servants flawless, the gossip fresh but not vulgar, you might find yourself invited to even grander tables. That could mean closer proximity to political allies, investment opportunities, or advantageous marriages. On the other hand, a poorly managed dinner could leave you socially adrift. your invitations mysteriously drying up like yesterday's aspic. Newspapers, too, played a role. Edwardian society loved to read about itself, and gossip columns thrived on the minutiae of dining. The names of guests, the gowns they wore, and even snippets of conversation sometimes made their way into print. This meant that your witty remark, meant for the amusement of 6 people around a mahogany table, might find itself echoing through the entire city by the next day. If you were lucky, it cast you as charming and clever. If unlucky, it cast you as a bore, a braggart, or, the worst fate, entirely forgettable. The humour writes itself. You survived the food, the fashion, and the small talk, but the real danger was opening the paper to discover you'd been publicly reviewed like a bad play. Even for hosts, the morning after was a test. They would review the evening with military precision. Were the flowers still fresh when dessert was served? Did the wine run out too early? Did anyone important leave before coffee? A truly catastrophic oversight, say failing to provide cigars of sufficient quality, could haunt a host for months. After all, a dinner party was not simply an evening of entertainment. It was a referendum on one's competence, wealth, and taste. The servants, too, would not escape scrutiny. If a dish arrived lukewarm or a bottle was corked, the household might face the wrath of its mistress, who knew her reputation depended on their invisible perfection. Yet for all the headaches, literal and figurative, the cultural imprint of Edwardian dining lasted far beyond the clinking of crystal and the rustle of silk gowns. Modern dinner etiquette, multiple forks, the order of wine service, the concept of polite dinner conversation owes much to this era. Even today, when someone lectures you about using the wrong bread plate, they are channeling the ghost of Edwardian propriety. The long shadow of those 6-hour suppers stretches into modern weddings, formal banquets, and the intimidating array of cutlery at any Michelin-starred restaurant. In the end, the morning after a feast revealed the true purpose of Edwardian dining, not just to feed, but to shape society. The indigestion passed. The gossip eventually shifted to newer scandals, but the memory of who sat where, who spoke brilliantly, and who committed some fatal faux pas endured. For the upper classes, a dinner wasn't a meal, it was an audition for social survival, and when you woke up the next morning, nursing a headache and flipping through the paper, you weren't just digesting last night's pheasant, you were digesting your place in the Edwardian world. Since the dawn of time, humans have looked up at the sky, pointed at the birds, and thought, yeah, I could totally do that. Spoiler alert, they could not. For thousands of years, flight was less about soaring majestically above the clouds and more about perfecting the art of plummeting dramatically back to earth. The dream of flight runs deep in mythology, with the Greeks giving us the most famous warning label of them all, the tale of Icarus. You know the story. Daedalus makes some wings out of feathers and wax, tells his son don't fly too close to the sun, and then naturally Icarus immediately does just that. The wings melt, gravity does its thing, and the Aegean Sea gets a new splashdown record. The moral? Flying is dangerous. The real moral? Teenagers don't listen. But humans weren't content to leave flying to the gods and the birds. Oh no. We kept trying. Medieval inventors spent centuries strapping contraptions of wood, cloth, and feathers to their arms, climbing towers and leaping off. And for centuries the result was the same, a very short flight followed by a very long recovery. The chronicles are filled with brave or possibly very bored people who thought wings were like shoes, you just put them on and go. They learnt the hard way that aerodynamics is not just a fancy word for flap harder. Take, for instance, Abbas ibn Firnas, a 9th century inventor from Cordoba. He built a winged glider, launched himself into the air, and reportedly managed to stay airborne for a few moments before crash landing and injuring his back. He survived, which was a victory in itself, but later reflected that he had forgotten one important detail: tails. Birds have them, humans don't. A detail easily overlooked if your main concern is not dying on impact. Centuries later, in England, a man named Aylmer of Malmesbury tried a similar stunt. Around the year 1000, he strapped wings to his arms, jumped from a tower, and supposedly glided over 200 meters before meeting the ground in a less than graceful finale. The chronicler notes he broke both his legs, but hey, at least he went farther than most people could throw a chicken, and yet the dream persisted. By the Renaissance, flight wasn't just a fool's errand, it became the obsession of geniuses. Enter Leonardo da Vinci, a man whose notebooks are filled with designs for ornithopters, flying machines, and parachutes. Leonardo watched birds with the intensity of someone trying to ace an exam, then sketched machines that looked like giant flapping bat wings or spinning screw-shaped contraptions. Did any of them fly? No, but they looked incredible on parchment, which is half the battle when you're inventing in the 15th century. If nothing else, he gave humanity its first serious exploration of aerodynamics and some very stylish doodles. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Europe, the Montgolfier brothers were doing something radical, replacing wings with balloons. In 1783, they launched a hot air balloon carrying a sheep, a duck, and a rooster. Why farm animals? Presumably because volunteers were hard to come by. The balloon flew over Versailles, and when the animals returned alive, if slightly confused, the brothers were hailed as pioneers. Humans had finally cracked the code, not flying like birds, but floating above them. Of course, the problem with balloons is that they're essentially floating fireplaces. They could rise, drift, and terrify peasants, but they couldn't be steered. Early passengers often ended up landing miles from their intended destination, sometimes in angry farmers' fields, where the locals assumed they were demons descending from the heavens, which, to be fair, is exactly how a giant flaming bag would look to anyone who had never seen one before. After balloons came gliders. In the 19th century, men like Otto Lilienthal devoted their lives to figuring out how to soar on wings rather than float in balloons. Lilienthal became known as the Glider King, launching himself off hillsides in Germany hundreds of times. He meticulously recorded data, analyzed wing shapes, and brought flight out of the realm of dreamers and into the realm of science. Unfortunately, he also became a tragic reminder of how unforgiving gravity can be. In 1896, after over 2,000 flights, his glider stalled and crashed, leading to fatal injuries. His last words were reportedly, "Sacrifices must be made," a phrase you'd rather hear in a philosophy class than on the way to the hospital. But despite the crashes, the broken bones, and the livestock air force, humanity kept climbing towers, hills, and cliffs, determined to fly. Why? Because flight wasn't just about getting from one place to another. It was about defying nature itself, about rising above the limitations of the human body. Every culture, every age, had its dreamers who looked at the birds and thought, why not us? And that's the stage the Wright brothers walked into. By the late 19th century, humanity had centuries of crashes, experiments, and burnt feathers behind it. We had balloons that floated, gliders that soared, and more broken limbs than a medieval battlefield. But one thing was missing: control. True, reliable, sustained, powered flight still lay out of reach. Humanity had been chasing the skies for millennia, but it was going to take two bicycle mechanics from Ohio to finally stop falling and start flying. When you picture the great inventors of history, you might imagine laboratories filled with bubbling beakers, chalkboards covered in equations, or perhaps eccentric men with wild hair scribbling formulas at midnight. What you probably don't imagine is two quiet brothers in Dayton, Ohio, surrounded by bicycle chains, grease, and the occasional squeaky wheel. Yet it was exactly that unlikely workshop, not a fancy university or a government-funded lab, that gave birth to modern aviation. Wilbur and Orville Wright didn't have the pedigree you'd expect from the men who would solve humanity's greatest technological riddle. They weren't professors, they weren't military engineers, and they certainly weren't rolling in cash. They were, quite simply, two mechanically minded brothers who thought bicycles were fun and physics was negotiable. As the joke goes, they weren't professors, they weren't scientists, they were bicycle mechanics, which is basically just engineering for people who like grease stains. The Wright brothers were born into a large, close-knit family in Ohio, Their father, Milton Wright, was a bishop in the Church of the United Brethren, a man of strict morals but surprisingly open to ideas. He encouraged curiosity and intellectual debate at the dinner table, giving his children a freedom of thought that would prove essential. Their mother, Susan Catherine Kerner Wright, was perhaps the hidden genius of the family. A gifted mechanic in her own right, she built small appliances and toys, and she was the one Wilbur and Orville inherited their knack for tinkering from. The family wasn't rich, but they were rich in one resource that mattered: imagination. Young Wilbur and Orville were obsessed with building things. One of their earliest fascinations came when their father brought home a small toy helicopter, powered by twisted rubber bands, based on a design by French aeronautical experimenter Alphonse Pénaud. The little contraption whirred into the air, delighting the boys and planting a seed that would grow into something far bigger. They built their own versions, and though the toys inevitably broke, the idea of machines that could defy gravity lodged itself firmly in their imaginations. But let's not kid ourselves. Before they made history, they made bicycles. In the late 19th century, America was swept up in the great bicycle craze. For the first time, ordinary people could travel faster and farther than ever before without feeding a horse or waiting for a train. Streets rang with the clatter of spokes, and bike shops were as common as coffee shops are today. The Wright brothers saw opportunity. In 1892, they opened their own bicycle repair and sale shop in Dayton, and soon they were designing and building their own models. Running a bike shop might sound humble, but it was the perfect training ground for two future aviators. Think about it. Bicycles demand a delicate balance between strength and lightness, just like airplanes. They require precise control over steering and stability, just like airplanes. And they run on the principles of gears, chains, and mechanics. The kind of principles the Wrights could apply to anything with moving parts. Every repair job was a lesson in physics. Every custom-built bicycle, a step closer to understanding how machines could carry people. The Wrights weren't just good at fixing bikes, they were relentless experimenters. They tested new gear systems, built bikes with varying frame designs, and tinkered with every possible detail. This was hands-on engineering at its best, the kind you don't get from textbooks. Their approach to invention wasn't about waiting for inspiration from above, but about working tirelessly with what was in front of them until something better emerged. And here's the key: they were self-taught. No university degrees hung on their walls. No professors lectured them on aerodynamics. Instead, they devoured whatever books, articles, and reports they could find. When Wilbur wanted to know more about flight, he wrote to the Smithsonian Institution, asking for everything they had on the subject. They read about gliders, they studied bird flight, and they debated endlessly in their shop while tightening spokes and wiping oil from their hands. This wasn't academic learning, it was learning in the trenches, or in this case among the tires and toolboxes of Dayton. Wilbur, the older brother, was the thinker, intense, focused, and often quiet, but with a razor-sharp mind for detail. Orville, the younger, was more easygoing, with a flair for building and a streak of showmanship. Together they formed a perfect balance. Wilbur would analyze, Orville would experiment, and between the two of them something extraordinary would emerge. Of course, to their neighbors they were just the local bike guys. Nobody looked at the Wright Cycle Company and thought, "Ah yes, the birthplace of aviation." It would be like imagining the first rocket to Mars being designed in the back of a skateboard shop. Yet that's the beauty of the Wright story. Genius doesn't always come wrapped in prestige. Sometimes it's hidden behind a rack of handlebars. By the time the Wright brothers began to think seriously about flying machines, they already had the mindset of problem solvers. They were comfortable with trial and error, they knew how to balance structures, and they understood the value of persistence. If a bike frame broke, they fixed it. If a gear slipped, they redesigned it. Failure was never the end, it was simply part of the process. That philosophy would carry them into aviation, where failure was measured not in broken spokes but in broken wings. And so, in a small workshop in Dayton, surrounded by wheels and wrenches, the brothers sharpened the skills that would change the world. They didn't yet know that their tinkering would take them from paved roads to open skies, but they had the curiosity, the tools, and the determination. The Wrights weren't just bicycle mechanics, they were inventors in disguise, and their workshop was less a store and more a launch pad. Little did Dayton know, the same shop that tuned up your neighbor's two-wheeler was quietly laying the foundation for human flight. For most of human history, flight seemed less like an engineering problem and more like magic. Birds did it effortlessly, insects buzzed around with irritating ease, and humans? Humans invented ladders. The trouble was, turning flapping really hard into a working transportation system proved far more complicated than anyone expected. To get a machine into the air, four forces need to be in balance: lift, drag, thrust, and weight. Lift is what gets you off the ground. Drag is what tries to stop you. Thrust is what pushes you forward. And weight is, well, your machine, and all the regrets you'll have when it falls out of the sky. On paper it seems simple. In practice, it was a nightmare. For centuries, inventors assumed the secret was power. Build a bigger engine, attach wings to it, and voila, flying machine. The result was usually a very expensive pile of wood and canvas hitting the ground faster than dignity could recover. One man who learned this the hard way was Samuel Pierpont Langley, secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, and one of the most respected scientists in America. In the late 1890s, Langley was given $50,000 from the US government to solve the flight problem, a fortune at the time. He had prestige, resources, and a team of experts. By comparison, the Wright brothers had a bicycle shop, a wind tunnel made of wood, and the kind of free time that comes from not being famous. Langley focused on power. He built a massive contraption called the aerodrome, essentially a giant steam-powered bird skeleton with wings. In 1903, he tested it over the Potomac River. The results were not great. On its first attempt, the aerodrome collapsed into the water like a lawn chair, giving up under too much weight. On the second attempt, the catapult launcher malfunctioned, hurling the plane straight into the river again. Cue the punchline. Langley had the funding, prestige, and brains. The Wright brothers had a bicycle repair shop. Guess which one crashed into a river? Langley's failure wasn't because he was unintelligent. Far from it, he was a brilliant astronomer and mathematician. His problem was that he saw flight primarily as an issue of power, more thrust, bigger engine, stronger frame. But what nobody had cracked was control, the ability to steer, balance, and keep an aircraft stable once it left the ground. Think of it this way. If you build a car that can go 100 miles per hour, but you forget to add a steering wheel, you don't have a car. You have a very fast accident waiting to happen. The same principle applied to early aircraft. Balloons could lift, gliders could float, but steering? That was the holy grail. Inventors tried all sorts of methods. Some built wings that flapped like bird wings, hoping human arms and levers could replicate nature. Others strapped tails on their machines in an attempt to mimic fish. Many simply hoped momentum would keep them steady, which is a bit like saying if you run fast enough with scissors, nothing bad will happen. Spoiler, something bad always happened. The Wright brothers, however, saw the issue differently. They studied birds carefully and noticed how they didn't just flap. They tilted, twisted, and adjusted their wings to maintain balance. A bird doesn't survive because it has wings. It survives because it can control them. That insight changed everything. Instead of obsessing over building the biggest engine, the Wrights obsessed over control surfaces. They asked, how do we bank? How do we turn? How do we avoid immediately flipping upside down and inventing gravity all over again? Their answer was something they called wing warping, twisting the ends of the wings slightly in opposite directions to roll left or right. It was a clever, almost elegant solution, and it came straight from years of tinkering with bicycles. If you can keep a bike upright with small shifts of balance, why not a flying machine? This focus on control made all the difference. While Langley's aerodrome plunged helplessly into rivers, the Wrights built gliders they could actually steer. Every flight wasn't just a test of wings and engines, but a test of steering and stability. They didn't want to make a machine that could leave the ground for 3 seconds and crash spectacularly. They wanted a machine that could fly predictably, reliably, and most importantly, be guided by the pilot. It's easy to laugh now at the idea that people thought power alone would solve flight, but at the time engines were new, powerful and exciting. They seemed like the obvious answer. The Wrights' genius was realizing that the real challenge wasn't brute force, it was finesse. Anyone can launch themselves into the air with enough energy. Staying there and not ending up in the nearest river is the tricky part. By the turn of the 20th century, dozens of inventors around the world were chasing the dream of flight. Some were gliding off cliffs, others were building bizarre contraptions that looked more like carnival rides than airplanes. Almost all of them were missing the same piece of the puzzle. They could imagine lift, they could build for thrust, but control was the part nobody had cracked. Nobody, that is, until two brothers in Dayton started asking the right questions. And so, while experts with government funding were sinking their machines in rivers, Wilbur and Orville Wright were quietly inventing the steering wheel of the sky. They didn't solve flight by overpowering gravity. They solved it by outsmarting it. If invention were a cooking show, the Wright brothers would have been the contestants who insist on trying every possible recipe for chicken wings, literally every wing shape, angle and curve, before deciding which one actually works. In their case, the kitchen was a small workshop in Dayton, Ohio, and their ingredients were wood, cloth, and the relentless curiosity that would eventually make them famous. By the late 1890s, Wilbur and Orville knew one thing for certain. The key to controlled flight wasn't raw power, it was precise aerodynamics. They understood that even the smallest change in wing shape could make the difference between gliding gracefully and crashing spectacularly. But how could two bicycle mechanics figure out the perfect wing without modern computers, supercomputers, or even accurate wind measurement tools? They built their own. Enter the wind tunnel, a small wooden contraption barely taller than a man, but with the power to revolutionize aviation. The Wright brothers' tunnel was simple by modern standards, a 6-foot-long box with a fan powered by a simple gasoline engine, a test section in the middle, and a place to mount tiny wing models. Into this tunnel they placed hundreds of miniature wings, measuring the lift and drag of each with mechanical balances. Essentially, it was a laboratory for airflow, or as Orville described it later, a place to make the air tell us its secrets. And secrets it did tell. The brothers were meticulous, recording data with an almost obsessive precision. They measured lift in pounds, drag in ounces, and angles of attack down to fractions of a degree. Every trial informed the next. If a wing generated more lift but more drag, they noted it. If it was stable but slow, they noted it. By the end of their experiments, they had compiled one of the most accurate sets of aerodynamic data in the world, and this was before the first successful powered flight. Their method was simple, but it required patience, dedication, and a touch of madness. They tested more wings than a fried chicken restaurant on Super Bowl Sunday, building model after model, flying miniature gliders, recording numbers, tweaking angles, and trying again. When the neighbors peeked in, they probably assumed the brothers were wasting time after all. Who spends years obsessing over the perfect curve of a wooden wing? But the Wrights understood that experimentation wasn't trial and error in a careless sense. It was structured, mathematical trial and error, a dialogue between observation and calculation. Math played a surprisingly central role in their work. Wilbur, the older and more theoretical of the two, loved numbers. He calculated lift, drag, and wing loading with formulas derived from fluid dynamics texts. The brothers combined this theoretical knowledge with the practical insights gained from their wind tunnel. Every tiny measurement, every calculation, every scribbled note brought them closer to the perfect wing, or at least the perfect wing that humans could control without plummeting to the ground. Persistence, of course, was non-negotiable. Not every wing shape worked, and not every model behaved as expected. Some gliders would veer uncontrollably to one side, while others refused to lift properly. Some measurements contradicted previous data, sending the brothers back to the drawing board. Yet each failure was treated as data, not defeat. In fact, their entire approach was a celebration of iterative design. Make a wing, measure it, note the flaws, and start again. They failed thousands of times, not because they weren't smart, but because flying is extraordinarily complicated, and they were the first to try solving it so systematically. What set the Wrights apart was their ability to combine theoretical science with hands-on experience. While other inventors built massive machines and hoped for the best, the brothers understood that control surfaces, wing shapes, and lift-to-drag ratios mattered far more than raw horsepower. Their wind tunnel allowed them to test ideas cheaply, safely, and repeatably. For the first time, flight became predictable, measurable, and improvable, no guesswork required. The wind tunnel also gave them a psychological edge. They weren't just hoping for flight, they were gathering proof that flight was possible. They could predict how their glider would behave before ever stepping on a sandy hill in Kitty Hawk. They had moved from tinkering to engineering, from imagination to experimentation. Every wing that didn't work, every glider that tipped awkwardly in a test, brought them closer to the day when a machine could leave the ground, stay aloft, and come back under the pilot's control. Persistence, observation, and mathematical rigor became the hallmarks of their work. By the time they were finished with their wind tunnel experiments, the brothers had analyzed hundreds of wing shapes, thousands of measurements, and countless hours of trial flights. They had turned the impossible problem of controlled flight into a series of manageable, testable challenges. Theirs was not a flight of fancy. It was the product of calculation, discipline, and obsessive tinkering. And all of this happened in a small, modest workshop, with a bicycle hanging from the wall, oil stains on the floor, and the occasional curious neighbor peeking in. No grand laboratories, no government contracts, just two brothers asking, what if we measured it this way, or twisted the wing like this? The results of their persistence would soon prove revolutionary, because when they were done testing, calculating, and failing again and again, they had created not just wings, but the blueprint for controlled, powered flight. It was methodical, it was obsessive, and it was absolutely necessary, because in aviation, as the Wright brothers understood better than anyone, you don't get to fly until you respect the wind, and if you respect the wind and test enough wings, eventually the wind will respect you back. If you were to ask a modern pilot where they'd like to test the world's first powered airplane, most would probably imagine a sleek runway, controlled conditions, and maybe a climate-controlled hangar. The Wright brothers, they went for dunes, isolation, and a healthy dose of mosquito-infested humidity. Welcome to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, circa 1900. Why Kitty Hawk? The decision wasn't whimsical, nor was it purely romantic. The brothers had been searching for the perfect testing ground for months. They needed three things: strong, steady winds to help lift their gliders, soft sand to cushion inevitable crashes, and isolation, so that nosy townspeople wouldn't trample experiments or scoff at the sight of a human-shaped kite flying precariously through the air. In other words, they wanted the perfect combination of natural assistance, natural padding, and natural privacy. And Kitty Hawk delivered. Located on the Outer Banks, the area is characterized by endless sand dunes and gusty Atlantic winds. In some ways it resembled a windswept desert, with a generous sprinkling of salt air, the ideal place to test something that refused to stay on the ground. The dunes gave the brothers natural ramps from which to launch their gliders. The wind gave lift without engines, and the isolation meant they could crash, burn, and rebuild without judgment. It was engineering heaven. If heaven smelled like sand and salt and made your shoes disappear in the dunes. The brothers first arrived at Kitty Hawk in 1900, hauling their glider and supplies by train, then by wagon, then by sheer determination. Setting up camp was no small feat. They pitched tents on shifting sands, built makeshift workbenches, and tried to maintain order amid relentless winds and pervasive humidity. Food and supplies had to be shipped in from far-off towns, meaning fresh vegetables were a luxury, and patience was mandatory. Meanwhile, mosquitoes were everywhere. Kitty Hawk had everything the Wrights needed: steady winds, soft sand, and mosquitoes that could file flight patents of their own, one might quip. And anyone who spent a summer on the Outer Banks would nod in grim agreement. Once settled, the brothers began testing their gliders under real-world conditions. Unlike in Dayton, where wind tunnels offered predictability, Kitty Hawk demanded adaptability. Wind strength could fluctuate wildly, gusts could send a glider spinning sideways, and sudden lulls would leave the craft plummeting into the dunes. Every flight became a negotiation with nature itself, lift versus drag, thrust versus control, determination versus gravity. And yet this chaotic testing ground was perfect for their approach. They thrived in trial and error, and every minor crash, and there were plenty, provided invaluable data. The dunes themselves became a kind of natural laboratory. The Wrights would climb to the top with their glider, check the wind and make minute adjustments to wing angles or tail settings. Even slight changes could transform a nosedive into a graceful glide. They recorded everything meticulously, noting wind direction, weight distribution, and the subtle ways the glider responded. Every step in the sand, every push off the dunes, was a rehearsal for something bigger. And then there was the isolation, which allowed them to focus like no one else. Few people ventured to Kitty Hawk regularly, and the local population was small, friendly, and used to oddities, though the sight of a bicycle mechanic and his brother flinging winged machines off dunes must have been perplexing. But the Wrights didn't need spectators or applause. They needed time, space, and privacy to fail spectacularly in peace. Because failing repeatedly, publicly, and sometimes spectacularly was the only way they could learn to fly. As the years passed at Kitty Hawk, the brothers honed their techniques. Their gliders grew more sophisticated, their control methods more precise, and their understanding of aerodynamics more intuitive. They tested wing warping, refined elevators, and learned to read the wind like a musical score. With every gust, every tumble into sand, every mosquito bite, they inched closer to the moment the world would finally see a human take to the air under their own power. The stage was being set for December 17, 1903. The brothers had chosen the spot, built the machines, and spent years understanding both their gliders and the natural forces around them. The dunes, wind, and solitude of Kitty Hawk were no longer just obstacles or annoyances. They were partners in experimentation. The world outside would remain unaware for now, but inside those wind-swept sands a quiet revolution in human capability was brewing. By the time the fateful day arrived, the brothers had faced enough failed flights, gusts, and sand-filled injuries to appreciate the magnitude of the moment. The wind was steady, the sand soft, and the machines, painstakingly designed, meticulously tested, were ready. It was the culmination of years of observation, calculation, and obsessive tinkering. Yet even then one could imagine the brothers standing at the top of a dune, glancing down at the Atlantic winds and thinking, will this finally work, or will we once again become human-shaped kites in a sandstorm? The tension was palpable. December 17, 1903, wasn't just another winter day in North Carolina. It was the day when centuries of human dreaming, mechanical curiosity, and the persistent questioning of gravity would either succeed or fail. The dunes, the wind, and the mosquitoes had witnessed every misstep leading up to this point, and now all that remained was to see if the Wright brothers could finally soar. December 17, 1903, began like any other winter morning at Kitty Hawk, cold, blustery, and filled with the quiet hum of restless wind. But for Wilbur and Orville Wright, this day was the culmination of years of meticulous preparation, endless experimentation, and enough sand-filled misadventures to qualify as a minor wilderness survival course. Today was the day they would attempt what no human had ever done: fly a powered, heavier-than-air machine under full control. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt and sand, and the wind blew at just the right strength, not too gentle to leave the machine struggling, not too fierce to send it tumbling into the dunes. The brothers had set up their glider-turned-airplane, the now famous Wright Flyer, on a makeshift launching rail. Every wooden beam had been measured, every bolt tightened, every cloth-covered wing inspected for wrinkles. The Flyer was a marvel of precision, with its 12-horsepower engine, twin propellers, and wing-warping system ready to prove that human ingenuity could defy gravity. Orville would pilot the first attempt, with Wilbur holding the Flyer steady and timing the effort. With a nod, the machine lurched forward along the rail, And then miracle, science, and a touch of sheer luck. The flyer lifted off. For 12 seconds it hovered, glided, and flew, covering 1 to 20 feet over the soft sands below. The world's first powered flight lasted 12 seconds, which is also roughly the average lifespan of a snack in a college dorm. But while the duration was brief, the significance was anything but. That single 12-second flight marked the transition from human dreams to human achievement. It proved that sustained, controlled, powered flight wasn't just a fantasy, a myth, or a newspaper exaggeration. It was real. No longer did humans have to cling to cliffs, dangle from balloons, or toss themselves off towers in hopes of gliding gracefully. Now they had the evidence that the impossible was possible, that a heavier-than-air machine could carry a human through the sky under their own control. The day didn't end there. Wilbur and Orville would take turns flying the flyer 3 more times, each flight gradually increasing in distance and confidence. By the 4th flight, Orville covered 852 feet in 59 seconds, a stretch of sky that would have seemed unimaginable, even to the most optimistic dreamers just weeks prior. Each flight, while short by today's standards, was a demonstration that flight wasn't a fluke. It was repeatable, controllable, and verifiable, the cornerstones of scientific achievement. The brothers documented everything meticulously. They measured distances, recorded times, and made notes on every quirk and wobble of the flyer. There were no crowds, no cheering fans, no headlines yet. Kitty Hawk remained isolated, the dunes and wind as their only witnesses. But in that quiet, the seeds of a revolution in human transportation were planted. And while the flyer came down after each flight, sometimes tipping onto its skids or shaking in the wind, the brothers' spirits soared higher than any machine ever had. It's tempting to underestimate the moment because in modern terms, 12 seconds seems laughably short. Today, we board planes that cruise for hours, crossing oceans and continents effortlessly. But in 1903, 12 seconds was the culmination of centuries of dreams, failures, and painstaking calculations. It was 12 seconds that proved humans could leave the ground at will, that technology could extend our abilities beyond our own muscles and bones, and that the sky was no longer a limit, only a challenge. Humor, of course, is unavoidable when you consider the scale. Imagine standing there witnessing the world's first powered flight, a frail canvas and wood contraption floating 10 feet above sand, propellers whirring, and the pilot holding his breath while gravity gave polite but firm resistance. And yet that tiny flight carried the promise of jumbo jets, space shuttles, and drones delivering snacks to your door. For all its brevity, those 12 seconds reshaped the world. The flyer itself would not survive intact. The brothers dismantled it to transport it home, and history would recognize it not for long-distance endurance, but for being the spark that ignited the age of aviation. Today, replicas hang in museums, and photographs capture a moment that looks almost comical in its simplicity. A man lying prone on a wooden frame with fabric wings, flying just above a stretch of sandy dunes. Yet for Wilbur and Orville, the reality was electric. Each second in the air validated years of testing, wind tunnel experiments, and mechanical problem-solving. And the broader implications? Those few seconds were the first proof that human flight could evolve. Future generations would take that courage, extend it, mechanize it, and one day see humans crossing oceans, circumnavigating the globe, and eventually reaching beyond the atmosphere. But it all started with 12 seconds, 120 feet, and 2 determined bicycle mechanics willing to risk life, limb, and dignity on a windy December morning. As the sun set over Kitty Hawk that day, the dunes bore silent witness to a moment that would echo through history. The flyer came down, the brothers packed up, and the wind carried whispers of what was to come. They had not conquered the sky entirely, far from it, but they had taken the first, irreversibly triumphant leap. Humanity could fly, and it would never look back. When Wilbur and Orville Wright took to the skies in 1903, they had no way of knowing just how far their modest 12-second flights would carry humanity. Those fragile wings, powered by a 12-horsepower engine and 2 mechanically clever bicycle mechanics, ignited an invention that would ripple through the 20th century and beyond. The leap from the sand dunes of Kitty Hawk to the roar of supersonic jets was unprecedented, and in retrospect almost comically fast. The immediate aftermath of the first flight wasn't a worldwide media frenzy. The news traveled slowly, and many remained skeptical. After all, the flyer was small, fragile, and it only stayed aloft for seconds. But in aviation circles, the significance was understood quickly. The Wright brothers had proven a principle that would become the cornerstone of flight. Controlled, powered, heavier-than-air machines were possible. The age of aviation had officially begun. The brothers didn't rest on their laurels. They spent the following years refining their designs, developing more powerful engines, improving control mechanisms, and expanding the flyer into more practical aircraft. Their gliders evolved into biplanes capable of carrying passengers, and soon the Wrights were demonstrating flights in front of paying audiences. While the feats themselves were impressive, it was the knowledge embedded in their designs that truly mattered. They had codified the rules of flight, transforming it from chaotic experimentation into replicable engineering. Of course, innovation rarely exists without contention. The Wrights became embroiled in patent disputes almost as soon as their invention gained attention. They defended their wing warping system and control mechanisms fiercely, fighting lawsuits against competitors and emerging aviation companies. To the public, it might have seemed petty, two men from Dayton arguing over who could twist a wing the best, but these battles underscored the value of their intellectual property. Their legal skirmishes weren't glamorous, but they were part of securing the recognition and resources needed to continue innovating. Meanwhile, aviation itself accelerated at a pace that stunned even the Wrights. By 1914, just over a decade after Kitty Hawk, planes were flying across continents. World War I pushed innovation even faster, with engineers designing planes capable of higher speeds, longer distances, and more complex maneuvers than the Wright flyer could have dreamed of. Within a few decades, commercial aviation emerged, connecting cities and continents, and shrinking the world in ways previously unimaginable. To put it in perspective, the first powered flight lasted 12 seconds, and within a generation pilots were crossing oceans in hours. This rapid progress highlights something extraordinary. The Wrights didn't just invent a machine, they unlocked a concept. The principles they discovered, lift, thrust, drag and control, provided a foundation for future generations of engineers to build on. Each advance, from biplanes to jets to supersonic travel, was essentially standing on the shoulders of two bicycle mechanics from Ohio. It's the difference between planting a seed and walking through a forest grown from it. Humor, of course, helps illustrate just how staggering the transformation was. By the time the Wright brothers died, one could say, planes were crossing oceans. By today's standards, that's the difference between inventing Pong and living to see Fortnite. In just a few decades, human flight went from experimental gliders barely skimming the sand to metal machines roaring across skies, with navigation systems, pressurized cabins, and speeds that would have made their 1903 flyer look like a paper airplane. The legacy of the Wrights extends beyond machines. They demonstrated the power of observation, calculation, and persistence. They showed that success often comes from combining theory and hands-on experimentation, and that invention requires as much patience as creativity. In essence, they provided a blueprint not just for airplanes, but for how to solve seemingly impossible problems. That blueprint inspired engineers, pilots, and dreamers for generations. By the mid-20th century, airplanes were routinely carrying passengers, goods, and mail across continents. Supersonic travel, aerial photography, and eventually spaceflight all trace their lineage to that first leap off a sandy dune. Every commercial airline, every military jet, and every spacecraft owes a debt to two brothers who spent countless hours experimenting with wing shapes, wind tunnels, and the patience to fail repeatedly. Ultimately, the Wright brothers' legacy is both technical and symbolic. Technically, they proved controlled, powered flight was possible. Symbolically, they demonstrated that human ambition can conquer even the sky itself. What began with a 12-second hop in Kitty Hawk became an entire century of progress that reshaped travel, warfare, commerce, and human imagination. The world was no longer limited to what could be walked, ridden, or rode. The sky, and eventually space, was open. And so, as we look back at Wilbur and Orville Wright, we see more than inventors. We see pioneers who took humanity's dream and gave it a practical foothold. From the sand dunes and mosquitoes of Kitty Hawk to the supersonic jets streaking across modern skies, their leap was the first note in a symphony of human ingenuity. Flight, once a fantasy, became a reality, and in doing so, forever changed the way we see ourselves and the world around us. In the 1930s, an excavation near Baghdad, Iraq, turned up a peculiar set of artifacts that left archaeologists scratching their heads and muttering phrases like, "Wait, what?" Buried in the sands of ancient Mesopotamia were clay jars that didn't quite fit any known category of pottery, each containing a carefully arranged copper cylinder and an iron rod. The find was so strange, so unclassifiable, that some researchers joked it looked like something a hyperactive alchemist had abandoned after a particularly bad chemistry experiment. The jars themselves were deceptively simple. Made from clay, they had the shape of a wine bottle with a narrow neck, roughly the size of a modern thermos. The copper cylinders fit snugly inside, and within those cylinders rested iron rods, held in place by an asphalt-like stopper. To a casual observer, it might have looked like someone had stuffed a rusty nail into a soda bottle and sealed it with tar, then buried it for posterity. Yet this simplicity masked the true intrigue. These objects appeared intentionally designed for some purpose that wasn't immediately obvious. Archaeologists examining the jars realized quickly that they didn't belong to the usual categories of Mesopotamian pottery or storage vessels. They weren't decorated with cuneiform inscriptions like ceremonial jars, nor did they resemble cooking pots, oil containers, or water jars. The craftsmanship was deliberate. The copper cylinder was carefully shaped, the iron rod precisely centered, and the stopper fitted snugly enough to suggest that whatever was intended to go inside needed protection. Every detail hinted at a purpose, yet the purpose remained frustratingly elusive. The discovery occurred during a period of increasing archaeological activity in Iraq, when scholars were uncovering treasures from the Parthian and Sassanid periods. These civilizations had long fascinated historians for their art, architecture, and technology, but the jars didn't match anything previously seen. Suddenly, a whole new question emerged. Could ancient civilizations have had knowledge of electricity? The idea seemed outrageous at first. Electricity, after all, is a concept most commonly associated with the 19th century, with light bulbs, dynamos, and telegraphs. But the jars hinted at something that didn't fit neatly into the timeline of technological development. The reactions among scholars were a mix of excitement, skepticism, and outright bafflement. Some thought the artifacts might have been ritualistic, symbolic objects. Others suggested mundane explanations. Maybe they were used to store scrolls or oils or medicinal liquids. Yet these theories never fully satisfied the curious details. The combination of metals, the asphalt stopper, and the way the components were nested. It all pointed to an intention that went beyond simple storage. The discovery ignited speculation in both scientific and popular circles. If these jars were indeed capable of generating electricity, even at a very low voltage, the implications were staggering. The Parthians, or whoever had made them, would have had an understanding of chemical reactions, metal conductivity, and the potential of an electrochemical cell, centuries ahead of anything previously known. For enthusiasts of ancient technology, the jars became a symbol of lost knowledge, a tantalizing hint that civilizations long before the modern era might have dabbled in experimentation that could rival 19th century inventors. Yet, as is often the case in archaeology, context was everything. The jars were found alongside typical everyday objects, pottery shards and coins, suggesting that whatever their function, it was not a major industrial activity. This added another layer of mystery. If they were capable of generating electricity, why wasn't it used for more than small-scale local purposes? Were these objects a form of experimentation, a curiosity, or perhaps even a novelty item, akin to a modern person tinkering with a battery kit for fun? The Baghdad battery quickly captured public imagination. Newspapers reported on ancient batteries that could have powered lamps or electroplating devices. Scientists began experimenting with replicas, trying to see if the jars could indeed generate a current. Enthusiasts speculated about Mesopotamian light bulbs, electrotherapy, and lost technologies that had vanished from history. The jars became, in a sense, a bridge between past and future, a dusty relic that hinted at scientific principles only fully understood millennia later. Humor, of course, is never far from these ancient mysteries. One can imagine a Parthian craftsman carefully assembling the copper cylinder and iron rod, stepping back and saying, "Behold, my revolutionary device. Now, where did I put the instruction manual?" The absurdity of imagining someone tinkering with proto-electricity thousands of years ago is part of what makes the Baghdad battery so captivating. It embodies the human tendency to experiment, to tinker, and to invent, even when the world isn't ready for the results. In the end, the discovery of the Baghdad battery did more than unearth a strange jar. It opened a window into ancient curiosity, craftsmanship, and the eternal human desire to manipulate the world. Whether or not it truly powered anything remains a mystery, but its ability to spark imagination, debate, and experimentation has made it one of archaeology's most enduring puzzles. From the sands near Baghdad, these jars whisper a tantalizing question to anyone who will listen. What else might ancient civilizations have known, and how much have we forgotten? To understand the Baghdad battery, it helps to stop imagining ancient wizards and start imagining jars. Yes, clay jars, but not your typical storage vessels for grain, oil, or wine. These jars are something else entirely. They are carefully constructed, precise, and strangely technical for artifacts dated to around 250 BCE to 250 CE. At first glance, one might say it's basically a mason jar, a rusty nail and some sticky goo, the starter pack for ancient electricity. But there's far more to unpack than that. Let's start with the clay jar itself. The jars are roughly 6 inches tall, tapering gently toward the top with a narrow neck. Made of fired clay, they were solid but not too heavy, light enough to handle, yet substantial enough to hold metal and liquid without breaking under ordinary use. Unlike typical Mesopotamian pottery, which is often ornately decorated or designed for culinary or ritual purposes, these jars are almost austere in appearance. Their simplicity is deceptive. Each jar was clearly crafted with a very particular goal in mind, and the fact that so many survive in relatively good condition suggests deliberate construction rather than casual creation. Inside the jar sits a copper cylinder, meticulously shaped to fit snugly within the container. Copper, as a conductive metal, has the advantage of allowing electrons to flow, which is why modern electrical engineers would nod approvingly. The cylinder is thin, uniform, and ends just below the mouth of the jar, leaving room for a rod and stopper. Unlike the crudely hammered copper plates common in other contemporary artifacts, this cylinder shows careful shaping and an understanding of metalwork that hints at a functional, not decorative purpose. Nestled within that cylinder is an iron rod, which fits inside like a central spine. Iron, prone to corrosion, is a metal that reacts readily with acidic solutions. When combined with copper and an acidic electrolyte, say vinegar or grape juice, it can create a small electric current. The rod is typically smooth, carefully cut to size, and held in place by the stopper at the top of the jar. The juxtaposition of copper and iron in such close quarters immediately catches the eye of anyone familiar with simple electrochemistry, hinting that the jar might have been more than a container. And then there's the asphalt stopper, the sticky tar-like plug that seals the jar. It's not merely functional, it's protective, ensuring that any liquid inside stays put and that the iron rod doesn't touch the copper cylinder directly, except through the liquid. Asphalt is impervious, flexible, and durable, an early example of thoughtful engineering. The combination of jar, copper, iron, and asphalt seems almost too intentional to be accidental. Each part is critical, and together they form a whole that doesn't quite fit any conventional use known from the period. Archaeologists and engineers have measured the jars with meticulous care. The internal volume, the thickness of the copper, and the length of the iron rod all suggest careful design. The jars are small enough to be handled easily, but large enough to contain enough electrolyte to produce a measurable current. The proportions are consistent across finds, which implies standardization, a concept surprisingly modern in its approach. Unlike decorative pottery or ritual containers that vary wildly in size and form, these jars share a uniformity that points to replication with purpose. So why is it so puzzling? Because nothing else from Parthian or Sassanid Mesopotamia resembles it. There are no contemporary references to electric jars in historical texts, no lamps explicitly designed to be powered by small electrochemical cells, and no obvious tools or machinery that could make use of such a device. In other words, the Baghdad battery does not match typical ancient tools. It's as if someone dropped a tiny piece of a modern science lab into a 2,000-year-old archaeological dig and walked away. Drawing it helps make sense of it. Imagine a cross-section, a rounded clay vessel, a snug copper cylinder surrounding a centrally positioned iron rod, and the sticky asphalt stopper holding it all in place. Even in drawings, it looks simultaneously primitive and advanced. Primitive in its materials, advanced in its apparent purpose. Scholars have reproduced diagrams in research papers showing how an acidic liquid poured into the jar could, in theory, produce a small voltage. Some experimental setups have even confirmed this, hinting at the possibility that these jars were functional rather than decorative. Humorously, one can picture an ancient artisan carefully assembling the components, looking at the jar and saying, "If this works, I may just light up the palace, or at least give my cat a mild shock." The mystery lies in the absence of records or instructions. Whatever its original purpose, it remains entirely speculative, yet the physical components are undeniably real, precise, and unlike anything else in the archaeological record of the region. In essence, the Baghdad battery is fascinating, precisely because it defies categorization. The clay jar is too engineered to be a simple container. The copper and iron combination is too deliberate to be coincidence. The asphalt stopper is too carefully applied to be an afterthought. Together they form an object that invites curiosity, experimentation, and a healthy dose of imagination. It challenges modern assumptions about ancient ingenuity, making one wonder how many other lost technologies remain buried in the sands, waiting to be unearthed and wondered about. By examining the Baghdad battery component by component, it's clear that we are looking at more than a jar. We are looking at a carefully crafted enigma, a physical puzzle whose pieces have survived millennia and still provoke questions. Was it a simple experiment, a tool for practical use, or a whimsical artifact of ancient curiosity? The jars themselves may never answer, but their design alone tells a story of thoughtful craftsmanship that is strikingly, intriguingly modern. Once you've laid eyes on the clay jar, copper cylinder, iron rod and asphalt stopper of the Baghdad battery, it's impossible not to wonder, could this little contraption actually generate electricity? The question has tantalized archaeologists, historians and amateur tinkerers for decades. Could an ancient civilization really have stumbled upon something that resembles the principles of a modern battery, or were we just projecting modern concepts onto an artifact whose purpose is forever lost to history? To explore this, let's start with some basic electrochemistry. Explained in plain language, a battery is, at its core, a chemical device that converts stored energy into electrical energy. It relies on two different metals and an electrolyte, a liquid that conducts electricity. One metal becomes the positive electrode, the cathode, the other the negative, the anode. When the metals interact through the electrolyte, a small flow of electrons, what we call electricity, is produced. In the Baghdad battery, the copper cylinder serves as one electrode, the iron rod as the other, and an acidic liquid such as vinegar, lemon juice or even grape juice could have acted as the electrolyte. So in theory, yes, This combination could produce a voltage, but don't imagine ancient Baghdad glowing like Times Square. The voltage generated by a single jar is tiny, usually around 0.5 to 1 volt, enough to light a tiny bulb if connected properly, or to run an electroplating experiment. Not enough to power a household lamp or send your neighbor a shock through the wall. Humorously, one can imagine a Parthian tinkerer proudly demonstrating his jar to friends. Behold, our lamp is lit, only for it to flicker weakly and die out, leaving his neighbors mildly annoyed. Nice try, Ahmed. Now stop shocking my cat. Over the years, scientists and hobbyists have attempted to recreate the Baghdad battery using replicas of the jars and plausible electrolytes. Some experiments succeeded in generating a small current, confirming that the design could indeed work as a rudimentary battery. For example, a group of researchers filled a replica jar with vinegar, inserted the copper and iron components, and measured a voltage. It wasn't a powerhouse, more like a tiny trickle of electricity, but it proved the principle. One jar alone might have produced about half a volt, but a series of jars connected in a chain could, theoretically, reach a few volts, enough for very modest tasks like electroplating small objects with thin layers of gold or silver. Electroplating is one of the leading theories for the potential use of these ancient batteries. Metal workers in Mesopotamia were known for their skill with precious metals. If they discovered through trial and error that a simple jar with copper, iron and acidic liquid could deposit a thin layer of metal onto jewelry or tools, the jars would have been revolutionary, even if they never produced light or powered machinery. In other words, they may have been practical, not magical, a way to manipulate metals with chemistry rather than sparks. Other, more speculative theories suggest the jars could have been used in ritual or medicinal applications. The idea of electrotherapy is modern, but there is evidence in multiple cultures that mild electric shocks were used for medicinal purposes, often accidentally. Imagine a curious ancient healer pressing a jar against a patient's skin, watching a small tingle, and proclaiming it miraculous. Whether intentional or accidental, the jar could have produced tiny shocks, enough to surprise, amuse, or mildly irritate someone. You call this healing, Hammurabi? My arm still tingles. Despite the fascination, it's important to remember the limitations. Even with an acidic electrolyte, the jars could not store energy for long periods. The voltage was low and current extremely weak. It's not like the Mesopotamians were sending power surges down alleyways. Modern experiments confirm that while the jars could generate electricity, the output is modest and inconsistent, highly dependent on the type of liquid used and the condition of the metals. One misstep, rusty rod, weak electrolyte, leaky asphalt stopper, and the battery does nothing at all. Yet this small voltage is enough to capture the imagination. It's one thing to see a battery produce a spark. It's another to imagine people in ancient times stumbling upon the principle by accident or experiment. The jars sit at a fascinating crossroads of possibility. Were they primitive scientific instruments, craft experiments, ritual objects, or simply clever containers that happen to generate electricity? Experiments in modern labs suggest that the electricity theory is plausible, even if no one can say for certain what it was actually used for. Humorously, we can picture Mesopotamians running around, connecting multiple jars together like a bizarre science fair project. One jar flickers, 2 jars sizzle, and 3 jars, well, maybe 3 jars make Hammurabi's lamp glow faintly. It's the equivalent of ancient DIY electronics, slightly messy, vaguely magical, and a bit disappointing if you expected a full-blown light show. Yet, the underlying principle is sound. Chemical reactions, metal electrodes, and acidic solutions can produce electricity. The Baghdad battery, whether used for plating, ritual, or play, shows that the Parthians may have had a conceptual grasp of a principle modern scientists wouldn't formally codify for another millennium. In the end, could the Baghdad battery really generate electricity? Experiments say yes, albeit modestly. Could it power a city or illuminate ancient Baghdad? Almost certainly not. But the jars represent the spark of curiosity, the kind that leads humans to experiment, fail, and try again. If it worked, the Mesopotamians could have charged their lamps, or maybe just annoyed their neighbors with tiny shocks, proving that even ancient inventors enjoyed a bit of mischief along the way. Once archaeologists and historians had examined the Baghdad battery, the immediate question was obvious: what exactly was it for? And immediately everyone shrugged. The jars don't come with instruction manuals, labels, or explanatory scrolls. Were they practical tools, ritual objects, experiments, or just the world's earliest party trick? The possibilities have sparked a spectrum of speculation, from the scientific to the whimsical. The most widely discussed theory is electroplating. Electroplating is the process of coating one metal with a thin layer of another using electricity. Imagine a shiny copper plate suddenly sheathed in silver or gold, a bit like an ancient version of gift wrapping, but for jewelry and decorative objects. Some scholars propose that the Baghdad battery could have been used for this purpose. Pour an acidic liquid into the jar, insert the copper and iron electrodes, and theoretically you could deposit a fine layer of metal on small objects. The voltage generated by a single jar is modest, but a series of jars connected in sequence could in principle produce enough electricity to plate tiny items like jewelry, coins, or ceremonial metal pieces. Yet there's a catch. No concrete evidence exists that the Parthians or other Mesopotamian civilizations actually used these jars for electroplating. Archaeologists haven't found ancient electrical wiring or completed electroplated objects definitively linked to the batteries. This leads to one of the core frustrations of the Baghdad battery mystery. Plausibility does not equal proof. In other words, while electroplating is a viable use, it may never have been the intended purpose. Another possibility is medicinal use. Throughout history, humans have experimented with mild electrical shocks in medical contexts. In modern times, we have devices that use tiny currents to stimulate muscles, treat pain, or even experiment with nerves. Could the jars have been an early, accidental version of electrotherapy? Perhaps a curious healer pressed the iron rod to a patient's arm after filling the jar with acidic liquid, witnessing a small tingle and proclaiming it miraculous. It's easy to picture the scene. Yes, I see it works. Your arm tingles. That must mean it's healing. While this theory is speculative, it aligns with a pattern seen in multiple ancient cultures, experimenting with electrical phenomena to treat ailments, whether by luck, observation, or superstition. Then there's the ritualistic angle. Objects like the Baghdad battery might have been used in ceremonial or religious contexts, symbolizing divine power, alchemy, or mystical forces. The jars could have been placed in temples or shrines, their purpose obscured by sacred secrecy. Perhaps the very act of assembling the copper and iron, adding an acidic liquid, and sealing it with asphalt was part of a ritual known only to initiates. After all, many ancient technologies were intertwined with spiritual practice, so it's not far-fetched to think that electricity might have been perceived as magical. And of course, some scholars consider the possibility that the jars were purely symbolic or decorative. Maybe they were fancy cups, ceremonial containers, or even the ancient equivalent of a novelty item. Humorously, one can imagine a Parthian artisan presenting a jar to a friend and saying, "Behold, I give you the world's first doorbell." Archaeologists shrug, puzzled and intrigued, because sometimes the simplest explanation, that it's just a well-crafted object with no practical function, is also a possibility. The lack of definitive evidence has fueled heated debates among historians and scientists. Those in favor of the battery theory point to modern reconstructions. Replicas filled with vinegar or lemon juice can indeed generate voltage, enough to electroplate small objects. Skeptics counter that the jars could have been used for something entirely mundane, such as storing scrolls, sacred liquids, or perfumes. Without written records specifying usage, the debate is destined to remain unresolved. Every hypothesis has strength, weaknesses, and a generous helping of speculation. Interestingly, this debate reflects a broader pattern in archaeology. The interpretation of intent is often as mysterious as the objects themselves. The jars are tangible, the metals are real, and the stopper is functional, but the mind of the ancient craftsman remains inaccessible. Did they intend to harness electricity, or were they simply experimenting for curiosity's sake, like a hobbyist tinkering with a new gadget without any grand plan? The answer is tantalizingly out of reach, leaving modern observers oscillating between awe, frustration, and amusement. The Baghdad battery also invites reflection on the human tendency to experiment and tinker, even when results are uncertain. Imagine assembling a jar, copper, iron, and liquid, waiting for something to happen, and realizing, well, maybe it works a little, or maybe it's just a fizzing curiosity. This process of trial, error, and imagination is timeless. Ancient Mesopotamians may have felt the same mixture of excitement and confusion that modern scientists do when a prototype succeeds or doesn't. In the end, we are left with multiple possibilities: electroplating, medicine, ritual, symbolic, or even playful experimentation. Was it a battery, a fancy cup, or the world's first doorbell? Archaeologists shrug. The beauty of the Baghdad battery lies not in certainty, but in the questions it inspires. Every jar, every rod, every stopper is a reminder that curiosity, ingenuity, and a touch of mystery are universal human traits. It's the intersection of science, history, and imagination. A tiny artifact that refuses to sit quietly in a museum case, insisting instead that we wonder, what did they know, and how did they think about the world around them? For every enthusiast who gleefully proclaims the Baghdad battery as proof of ancient electrical knowledge, there is a critic ready to counter with a firmly raised eyebrow. Skepticism has been, and remains, a major part of the story. After all, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and for an artifact over 2 millennia old, that evidence is hard to come by. The central argument of skeptics is straightforward. The jars likely couldn't produce usable electricity in any meaningful way. While modern experiments suggest that a replica can generate a small voltage, the output is extremely low, often a fraction of a volt, and the current is so weak that it would struggle to power even the tiniest device. In practical terms, this would have been largely useless. There's no evidence that ancient Parthians were stringing wires to charge lamps, electroplate gold systematically, or use electricity for entertainment. Critics argue that if electricity was intended, there would likely be clearer signs, traces of wiring, repeated use across multiple artifacts, or written instructions describing the phenomenon. None of this exists. Alternative explanations abound, and many are far less glamorous than ancient battery. One suggestion is that the jars were simple storage vessels. They could have held scrolls, sacred oils, perfumes, or medicinal liquids. The copper and iron may have been structural supports or even symbolic. For instance, the combination of metals could have represented alchemical or spiritual ideas rather than functional electricity. Some jars may have been scroll containers, keeping delicate papyrus safe from moisture and pests. The battery hypothesis, while exciting, could be reading far too much into a clever but mundane design. Another possibility is that the jars were used in corrosion tests. Metals corrode naturally when exposed to acidic liquids, and the Parthians were skilled metallurgists. It's plausible that they noticed how iron and copper interacted with certain substances and used the jars to study these reactions. This wouldn't produce meaningful electricity, but would explain why someone bothered combining these elements in a controlled setup. In this context, the jars would be early laboratory tools, entirely practical for metallurgy, but with no hint of generating power for lamps or devices. The heart of the debate is a problem that modern historians and scientists often face. Proving ancient electricity is extraordinarily difficult. Unlike physical objects that can survive intact, electricity leaves no trace. There are no sparks frozen in time, no faint hum etched into clay. We are left with indirect evidence, combinations of metals, the presence of an acidic environment, and physical arrangements that suggest potential function. But potential is not proof. The same arrangement could just as easily have served symbolic, ceremonial, or experimental purposes, unrelated to electrical currents. Humor often accompanies these debates, as the disputes themselves have become part of the story. Enthusiasts and skeptics alike have been known to engage in spirited discussions at conferences, in journal articles, and in popular media. One historian quipped that the only thing the Baghdad battery truly powered was a heated argument between archaeologists. Indeed, much of the attention has shifted from the artifact's potential function to the conversations it sparks, debates that mix science, imagination, and a touch of competitive pride. Critics also emphasize the limitations of modern reconstructions. While replicas can produce a tiny voltage in controlled lab settings, the original jars would have faced numerous obstacles: corrosion of the iron rod over time, leakage through the asphalt stopper, variability in the acidic content of liquids, and inconsistencies in manufacturing. Even if the jars worked, their performance would have been unpredictable and short-lived. Skeptics argue that the jar's practical utility was likely minimal, and the battery explanation may be reading too much into a simple object. Some even point out that the jars may have never been intended to generate electricity at all. After all, humans are expert pattern seekers. We often see intention where none exists. The copper cylinder and iron rod may have been chosen for durability, symbolic meaning, or even artistic preference. The combination could have seemed purposeful to the maker without any concept of electron flow. From this perspective, the jars are remarkable artifacts of craftsmanship and design, but not necessarily evidence of lost electrical knowledge. Despite skepticism, the Baghdad battery continues to captivate minds precisely because it sits at the intersection of plausibility and mystery. Critics remind us to temper excitement with careful reasoning. Just because an artifact could theoretically produce electricity does not mean it was intended to do so. At the same time, even if the jars never powered lamps, they still tell a story of human curiosity and ingenuity. Someone went through the effort to create a carefully designed object. That in itself is remarkable, regardless of whether it ever lit a light bulb. Ultimately, the skeptic's stance highlights a key lesson in archaeology and history. Sometimes, the most fascinating aspect of an artifact is not what it did, but what it makes us wonder. The Baghdad battery may or may not have been a functional electrical device, but it has certainly generated one kind of current: the flow of ideas, speculation and debate across decades. And in the end, perhaps that is the closest we'll ever get to measuring its real power. For decades, the Baghdad battery has tantalized both historians and experimental archaeologists with its potential to generate electricity. But speculation alone could not answer the question, did it actually work? To find out, modern scientists decided to put theory into practice, recreating the jars in laboratories around the world. The results were as fascinating as they were modest, and as it turns out, slightly shocking. Reconstructing the Baghdad battery is not as simple as assembling a clay jar, copper cylinder, and iron rod. Modern experimenters strive to match the materials and dimensions as closely as possible to what was found in Iraq. The copper cylinders must be precisely shaped, the iron rods accurately sized, and the asphalt stopper carefully fitted. Then comes the choice of electrolyte, a crucial factor in any attempt to generate electricity. Researchers have tried a variety of liquids thought to be available in the Parthian era: vinegar, lemon juice, grape juice, even fermented liquids with high acidity. Each choice produces different results, demonstrating that the jar's effectiveness is highly sensitive to the chemical environment. One of the earliest and most notable experiments was conducted by German researcher Wilhelm König in the 1930s, soon after the jars were unearthed. He filled replicas with vinegar, inserted copper and iron electrodes, and measured the voltage. To his surprise, the setup produced a small current, enough to power a low-voltage device like a tiny bulb or perform rudimentary electroplating. It was a thrilling moment. An artifact thought to be decorative or symbolic suddenly had demonstrable functional potential. Modern scientists have since confirmed König's results, showing that the jars can reliably produce a voltage between 0.5 and 1 volt under controlled conditions. However, the current is very weak, often in the range of milliamperes, meaning it would struggle to power even the simplest electrical device. Humorously, one might say, modern scientists recreated it, and yes, it produced a tiny jolt enough to wake a mosquito maybe. Despite the small output, the experiments demonstrate that the Baghdad battery is not merely a curious artifact. It is a functional device, albeit on a miniature scale. Practical demonstrations also reveal other limitations. The jars are sensitive to corrosion. Iron rods deteriorate quickly in acidic solutions, and the asphalt stopper can degrade or fail over time, allowing liquid to leak. These factors reduce efficiency and lifespan. Yet, even with these imperfections, the jars show remarkable craftsmanship. The Parthian artisans who created them clearly understood the properties of copper and iron, and how these metals interact with acidic liquids. They may not have formalized Ohm's law or measured voltage in volts, but their design reveals a sophisticated understanding of materials and experimentation. One of the most fascinating modern experiments involves replicating a full battery chain. By connecting several jars in series, scientists have produced slightly higher voltages, enough to electroplate a small metal object. These recreations offer a glimpse into the potential practical uses of the jars. While there is no direct archaeological evidence that ancient Mesopotamians ever did this, the experiments confirm that the jars could, in theory, have been used for electroplating or other small-scale electrical applications. This strengthens the idea that the Baghdad battery might not have been purely symbolic, but rather a device born from curiosity, trial, and experimentation. These modern experiments also highlight an important lesson about ancient ingenuity. The Parthians and perhaps other Mesopotamian civilizations were capable of precision craftsmanship, careful observation, and iterative testing. They assembled metals and liquids with care, achieving results that prefigure discoveries formally documented over a millennium later. Even if the jars were not used for electricity, the act of designing and constructing such a device demonstrates the same spirit that drives engineers and scientists today. Observe, hypothesize, experiment, fail, and try again. Beyond the technical lessons, the recreations offer a sense of wonder. Holding a jar filled with vinegar, with a copper cylinder and iron rod in place, one can imagine an ancient tinkerer peering intently, waiting for a reaction. Perhaps they saw a tiny spark, a faint current, or a subtle chemical effect, and celebrated the discovery. In this sense, modern experiments connect us directly with human curiosity across the centuries, showing that the drive to explore and experiment transcends time. Even though the output is minimal, the Baghdad battery serves as a reminder that innovation is often incremental. The jars may not have lit up cities, but they represent an early attempt to harness natural phenomena, an attempt that required careful observation, clever materials, and patient experimentation. By recreating the jars, modern scientists have not only tested their functionality, but also honored the ingenuity of their ancient makers. In the end, the modern experiments confirm something both humbling and inspiring. The Baghdad battery, whether used for electroplating, ritual, or playful experimentation, demonstrates that curiosity and ingenuity are timeless. A tiny jolt may not seem impressive to us today, but for an ancient artisan, it was a spark of discovery, and perhaps, just perhaps, a little bit of fun. Few archaeological artifacts have sparked as much debate, imagination, and sheer speculation as the Baghdad battery. From the moment the jars, copper cylinders, and iron rods were unearthed near Baghdad in the 1930s, they have been a magnet for curiosity. Their enigmatic construction hints at knowledge that seems far ahead of its time, and their potential, whether practical or symbolic, has captured both scientific minds and popular imaginations for nearly a century. One of the reasons the Baghdad battery fascinates so many people is its ambiguity. Unlike monumental achievements such as the pyramids or Roman aqueducts, these small jars do not scream for attention. They are modest in size and unassuming in appearance, yet their construction raises profound questions about ancient ingenuity. Could people 2,000 years ago really have experimented with generating electricity? If so, what does that say about the sophistication of Parthian metalworking and chemistry? The jars occupy a space between historical fact and tantalizing speculation, which makes them endlessly intriguing. Culturally, the Baghdad battery has made waves far beyond the world of archaeology. Museums around the globe display replicas, drawing crowds eager to glimpse what may have been the world's first battery. Popular media often seizes upon it as an emblem of lost technology or advanced ancient knowledge. Books, documentaries, and online articles speculate about its function, sometimes scientifically, sometimes wildly imaginatively. Some conspiracy theorists even suggest it is evidence of alien intervention or forgotten civilizations. While these claims are far-fetched, they highlight the artifact's unique ability to inspire storytelling, imagination, and debate. Humor naturally follows in discussions of the battery. Its modest voltage has led to countless quips over the decades. For instance, it may not have powered a city, but it sure powers speculation. Tiny though it is, the Baghdad battery has sparked far more energy in the human imagination than it could ever generate as a device. This humor also reflects a deeper truth. Fascination with ancient artifacts often combines awe, curiosity, and a bit of playful exaggeration. We marvel not only at what the object could do, but at what it might represent. A glimpse into the experimental mind of someone long gone. Scientific investigations continue to shed light on its construction and potential. Modern recreations have confirmed that a single jar could produce a small voltage, enough for rudimentary electroplating or minor chemical reactions. These findings lend credence to the idea that the artifact was, at minimum, a carefully designed experiment. Yet, because there is no written record of its intended use, definitive answers remain elusive. This uncertainty, rather than diminishing its appeal, enhances it. People are drawn to puzzles, and the Baghdad battery remains one of archaeology's most beguiling enigmas. The legacy of the Baghdad battery is also a reminder of the universality of human curiosity. Across time and culture, humans have experimented with materials, tested ideas, and tinkered with the world around them. The jars represent a mindset that is instantly recognizable to modern engineers and scientists. Observe, hypothesize, test, fail, and try again. Even if the Parthians were not producing electricity in the modern sense, they were engaging in a process that mirrors the scientific method, a testament to the timelessness of curiosity and experimentation. Interestingly, the Baghdad battery has influenced both education and popular imagination in the modern era. Students of archaeology, history, and engineering often encounter it as an example of thinking outside the expected parameters. It challenges assumptions about technological timelines and reminds us that innovation does not always follow a straight line. From museum exhibits to classroom discussions, it serves as a bridge between ancient craftsmanship and contemporary scientific inquiry. Finally, the Baghdad battery is a celebration of possibility over certainty. Its modest materials, clay, copper, iron, and asphalt, may not have lit a palace or powered a workshop, but they represent the spark of inquiry. For every person who has held a replica, measured its voltage, or imagined its potential, the artifact is a reminder that curiosity is not bound by time. Ancient artisans may never have left written instructions, but they left evidence of experimentation, problem-solving, and the drive to explore the unknown. In conclusion, the Baghdad battery captivates because it embodies the intersection of mystery, ingenuity, and imagination. It reminds us that humans have always been experimenters, dreamers, and inventors. Whether it was a tool for electroplating, a ritual object, or simply a clever experiment, its enduring appeal lies in what it represents: the eternal human fascination with discovery. It may not have powered a city, but it continues to power wonder, debate, and inspiration across the centuries. The jars sit quietly in museums, but in minds around the world they spark energy far greater than any small current ever could.